Hello and welcome back to this damn fully idealistic crusade. I am the motion picture analyst, and this is continuing in my series of commentaries on the official James Bond film series. Today we will be talking about Bond 20, known otherwise as 2002's Die Another Day, which proved to be the fourth and final film of the Pierce Brosnan era, directed by Lee Tamahori and released to great box office success, but is a film that ultimately is extremely reviled and looked down upon as one of the worst films in the series. I don't think it's any stretch to say it's the weakest and most problematic film of the original 20-film series, and for myself personally is the only film that makes me cringe in a lot of places. And it took me an extremely long time to come to terms with the film. I saw it on its original release 3 times theatrically, but there was just something I couldn't put my finger on. And I think over repeat viewings over the years, that initial sense of being overloaded and overwhelmed with the very over-the-top and kinetic and intensive, hyperactive energy that the film continues to have throughout every single scene and sequence, you're able to process things better and, again, process what you're actually seeing and sitting through. So nowadays, I think there's a general consensus that, the first section of the film is quite strong, and then it eventually loses its way. We all squabble over at what point we consider the going downhill section is. But I actually think it's a number of issues that caused the problems in Die Another Day. And it's not just that it was an over-reliance on very unconvincing and very terrible CG effects work, but it's very hard to nail down how this all came into being. And really what I think happened once you study various production reports, and particularly the very informative director commentary, and especially the original making of documentary that's on the original DVD, Making Up Die Another Day, made by the great Charles D. Lauzarica. You can see how everyone went into this film off the success of The World Is Not Enough, and we're trying with good faith and great intentions to bring Bond into the new millennium and continue with the seeming success of trying to give Bond more character beats and try to appease some of Pierce Brosnan's wishes of trying to, as he always put it, peel back the layers of the onion of Bond's character. But I think over time, what happened was the writers Purvis and Wade returned, and once again they came up with a great concept that just feels like the execution goes wildly off the track. And this was the one film of the 4 that there is not a credited additional group or additional writer. This is the one that is credited to Purvis and Wade solo. Although over the course of the production, it became very much a developed script. There were some on-set rewrites, particularly the ending was rewritten during production. But while myself and a lot of others used to always criticize Purvis and Wade for their script, I think the primary factor in the problems of Die Another Day is actually the director Lee Tamahori, and that's something I'm going to return to a lot in this commentary. And it's not to badmouth Tamahori, who did, again, like everyone else and the rest of the Eon team, come in to the film with great intentions. But I think Tamahori was allowed too much carte blanche and injected a lot of elements that are really not fitting for a James Bond film or with the series identity, and that is the cringe factor with Die Another Day. And he was very preoccupied and really obsessed with the idea of having to meet the marketplace at the time, which was dominated by big features to appeal to the biggest market of preteen young boys and young men of the 10 to 20 age bracket. So Die Another Day, while like other Bond films does have to compete with other films in the marketplace, it does lose a lot of the Bond identity. And so thus, in a lot of ways, stylistically, it starts to resemble a lot of those other films. So the other film that came out around the same time was, of course, the film Triple X, which starred Vin Diesel and was very successful, but was a Bond derivative. And so this film, Die Another Day, is starting to trying to match films like that, it cheapens the fact that it is an official Bond film. And of course, Tamahori would go on to, after Die Another Day, actually go and make the Triple X sequel, which is seemingly fitting. But I think with this point in the series, when new directors came on, they were allowed to reshape things and sort of push past the boundaries of the traditional Bond formula for better or worse. And Die Another Day, I think, is the worst example of that. Tamahori did come up with a number of interesting ideas, but he also came up with a number of off-the-wall ideas that were worked into the script. So again, the script is credited solely to Purvis and Wade, but pretty much every over-the-top and out-there element that really pushes the story firmly into over-the-top fantasy in areas, but particularly inducing major cringes in the audience, particularly for longtime Bond fans and diehard nerds like myself. Again, Tamahori does have a tendency to do this in some of his other films, even in the film that really got him the job, that really impressed people first off the bat, was the film he made, Once Were Warriors. And while that's a very gripping drama, you can see some over-the-top flourishes, and everything seems to be dialed up to 11 across the board, and that even comes into Die Another Day, where subtlety was needed. We don't really get any of that, even in the quieter and more subtle moments. So you really have to push past the brashness of the film to find stuff to enjoy, and Bond sort of takes a back seat to the events at large. So for me, it's taken a long time to finally get at that sort of core nugget and kind of come up with my own feelings on the film all over again. It's interesting that Die Another Day did have a relatively positive reception on its original release. I remember, outside of some critics not being very pleased, there were critics who did think it was great, and the audiences I saw it with, again, I saw it 3 times theatrically because it was the Bond film released at the time where I had more of an ability to go to a movie theater on my own as a young teenager. But it seemed everybody was relatively pleased with it, but I myself, already as a Bond diehard, did have some inklings and issues with it, and I did think it went too far in some places. All of this got magnified once the film came to DVD shortly thereafter, and I started watching it religiously like I did the other films. And I think with more repeat viewings, the problems and issues become more and more glaringly apparent. There is still stuff in the film that is interesting. There are some interesting ideas, and once again, I think the writing team of Purvis and Wade came up with an interesting plot hook to start off the film, but I feel, unfortunately, it doesn't really get developed, because what they did was then go into a major piece of Fleming that had not been adapted, because really, Die Another Day is not necessarily an original story. It is a reworking of the Fleming Moonraker novel plot, and so instead of Hugo Drax, we have the invented character of Colonel Moon, who becomes the character of Gustav Graves. So Graves is essentially a reworking of the Hugo Drax character from the novel, and pretty much starting from the initial encounter between Bond and Graves at the club and the sword fight, it basically becomes a reworking and reimagining of the Moonraker plot, which of course was not used for the 1979 film Moonraker. So what you have essentially is a film that has an entirely different opening 35 some odd minutes that is set up for the reworking of the Moonraker plot. And then that's why I think you can feel there is a distinct point where the film kind of becomes something else entirely. And it's understandable why they did this, because they had to build up to the Moonraker part. Just like in the novel, when you read it, there is a bit of a build-up, but it's using Bond's everyday office life to give more sense of character and to build up to the introduction of Drax, which is seemingly an ordinary experience, as Fleming liked to do. And then, of course, what goes on under the ordinary surface is far more extraordinary. And then eventually Bond is reintroduced to Drax, and then the general plot of the novel comes into play. And the whole book takes place in England. It's one of the few Bond novels that is entirely UK-based and really has much more of a sense of being a mystery suspense thriller, particularly since Once Bond goes out to the Drax estate, it's much like what we see in the film Moonraker when Bond is at the Drax Chateau, and there are mystery hijinks that go on from there, and it's a very character-focused story, very very small scale. So it would make a great film if they ever did it straight, but it would not have the traditional bombastic quality of a James Bond Eon film. So it makes sense that Purvis and Wade took this unused story, pretty much, because again, it had not been really used, and then transformed it into a bombastic Bond experience, and interwove everything into the Pierce Brosnan era. Again, I do think a lot of the idea going into the film, I think the story idea is perfectly fine, and again, it's an example of Purvis and Wade finding a nugget or a piece of Fleming that hadn't been used. They did work in some Fleming pieces into The World Is Not Enough, which I tried to highlight in my commentary on that film. So it is appreciated that they were doing that, because again, not a significantly smaller part of the fan base is invested in the novel Bond, which is very different from the film Bond. So any bit of Fleming that's ever worked into the films, particularly the later films, is always very much appreciated, but it's just not entirely successful, because it's a great serious concept that ultimately gets turned into a bombastic film that is so over the top and so riddled with energy that it almost feels in places like it actually has attention deficit disorder itself. This is not helped by the editing flourishes and the speed ramps and force bits of slow motion. It also doesn't help that, again, I think a great deal of subtlety is lost where it's really needed, and why the opening section is really the most satisfying in the film, because we stay with Bond. We're on a mystery of sorts. It's much quieter than the rest of the film to come, and it's much more enjoyable for those reasons. So Die Another Day is a film that I still return to every year. It is a very disappointing experience, but you can see the good in it. Once again, Pierce Brosnan really carries the film with his performance. But again, I want to highlight that unfortunately Bond really takes a back seat to a lot of things and seems much more reactionary than he should be. That hurts even the more because the opening concept of Bond being captured in North Korea and held prisoner and then essentially going rogue, very akin to License to Kill for the opening section. And it's so much more enjoyable seeing Bond actually use his wits and be himself and follow the breadcrumbs of the mystery in the opening section than what eventually happens for the rest of the film once we end the sequence in Cuba and everything suddenly becomes much more bombastic, and we lose the elements of spycraft and Bond actually using his wits, and then eventually we have just gadgets galore and explosions, and it seems once again that everything is cranked up to 11. So it's unfortunate that I think Purvis and Wade get a lot of the blame for the longest time. But again, I don't think their original concept was perfect. I would love to be able to read the screenplay drafts, but unfortunately there's none available online outside of just transcripts of what we got in the film. From what's suggested, I think their original draft was, probably much more like the opening sections. I know they have sworn up and down that the invisible car was not their idea. Again, a lot of ideas were actually Tamahori's, and while it's natural on a Bond film for everyone to work together and develop the film over time and sort of rework things here and there, you usually, at least up until this point, you didn't have the director, voicing a lot of brand new ideas on a consistent basis. So I would be very curious to read the screenplay drafts because, one often wonders, did Tamahori did so much and contributed so many ideas that make Die Another Day. I don't know if he would deserve any writing credit, but I think he definitely injected a lot of his own personality into the film and trying to shake it up and make it much more of an experience and to try and compete with the other films of the early 2000s where CG was running rampant, and also to appeal to the ever-growing youth market, all of which really does the film a disservice because a Bond film should be a Bond film first and foremost. And again, everybody likes to talk about the CGI usage, which is pretty dire in places, and it hurts all the more because Bond is prided and known for its realistic and actually done for real stuntmanship. I also think that Peter Lamont's amazing set design and production design gets hurt by the film's representation and everybody thinking about the CG usage. No one is paying as much attention to his really incredible production design, particularly the Cuba sequences and, of course, the amazing Ice Palace set. So there's a lot of things to talk about in the film, and I'm going to try to do my best to get into this stuff and not just harp on about the usual thing you're going to hear everywhere else about, oh, the CGI is terrible and the movie's not any good. It does have problems, but I'm going to try to explain where I think this stuff came into play and how this is really an example of a director getting too much carte blanche to just sort of run with the ball, and everybody sort of went with it. And if you listen to all the PR materials and the extras and things that were made around the time of the film's release, everybody seems pretty pleased with the overall film, even the CG effects and tiptoeing into that world with a Bond film. It wasn't until really the backlash started coming out that everybody started to kind of downplay the film. There, of course, they were trying to sell the film at that point, 2002, so they could have just been, gilding the lily, as it were. But I do think everyone thought they had done a pretty good job at that point. And again, there are good things in the film, which I will try and highlight as I do my usual scene-specific scene analysis and character analysis. I think Raymond Benson actually did some interesting things in his novelization, which unfortunately is really the last novelization we have for a Bond film. And while it does follow the film script pretty much beat for beat, he does have some extra scenes here and there. One in particular I'll highlight when we get to that point in the film that I really love. There are some things that were dropped from the original draft. And then he also manages to add a few extra lines here and there and really restore some of Bond's character and Bond taking initiative. So if you've never enjoyed the film but you kind of like the story idea, you can actually read the novelization. It plays a lot better in print. Even though obviously it is the film script and the film story, there are some nice extra beats, and it doesn't have that consistent over-the-top factor. Also helps your reading it in print instead of watching the film again. So Down Another Day is a film that I have a long history with, of course, ever since seeing it multiple times on its original run. It's a film that has not particularly aged very well, but it's a film I do wind up defending against everyone who pretty much usually writes it off entirely. There are some good things in it, and unfortunately this was where Pierce Brosnan's tenure really ended. He never got a fifth film to really go out on a high note and sort of round off and finalize his tenure in the role, which I think is very unfortunate. The film was amazingly successful for MGM and Eon, but unfortunately, and it's rather unclear how this all came to pass, they eventually decided to hit the reset button and essentially end the original 20-film series and start off on an entirely new path, essentially doing a extreme version of what Michael G. Wilson and Richard Maybaum thought about doing in 1986 with a potential prequel film to start the Timothy Dalton era in The Living Daylights. Now, at this point, I usually mention some technical notes about the film and its versions on DVD before I start into the commentary proper. This is a film released in the digital sound era, so of course it had a 5.1 sound mix. And really, the saving grace of watching this film repeatedly is the sound mix is absolutely excellent. It is a very aggressive, wonderful track. It's never been remixed, thankfully. It was released with Dolby Digital EX and DTS ES processes applied, so it has a rear center surround track. So you will hear sounds directly behind you in a home theater environment. This has been maintained on the Blu-ray and others, but other versions. But if you want to actually specifically engage that, you will have to engage that in your receiver. But in any case, this film has a wonderful sound mix that is a wonderful joy to listen to. So that is what I always tell people if they're not wanting to watch Night Another Day again. I always ask, have you seen it in a home theater environment? Because this film did pack a nice punch in its theatrical run because it had a very nice, aggressive sound mix. And so it's a film I actually still enjoy watching simply because the sound mix is such a pleasure to listen to. So while Die Another Day is a problematic film and a film I do have many issues with and a film that makes me cringe in a lot of places, I still do defend it. I still rewatch it every year as part of my series rewatch. And I do really think there are some good things in it. So I will try and highlight those and talk about the various production factoids and things that come to mind and mention the novelization in certain places and some deleted materials and things as we go along. As always, these are not professionally recorded tracks. It's just my own general thoughts on the film, scene by scene as it runs. And as fast as I can get words out and process my thoughts, that's what I'm doing here. It's a one-sided conversation that I hope you will be able to enjoy, and it continues in my series of Bond commentaries. So with that out of the way, that is my pre-ramble, as I like to call these, to introduce my commentary track. So definitely go ahead, and if you wish to sync this to a version of the film, go ahead and pull up your copy of the film and try and scrub past the opening MGM logo and start in the black area just before the gun barrel iris first comes into frame. That way we can do a rough sync and all be on relatively the same page, because as always on any copy of the film, video or streaming, you will probably have different logos, so the timings are not exactly right. So I've found it's best to usually skip past those and try and start right on the film start, so that way we're all in the same area. And again, this is not professionally recorded, so don't worry if you're not exactly on sync. You should be able to relatively know where I am in the film, and we should all be in a similar area if we all sync right there at the black frame area. So we'll do a rough count-in now, and just to introduce this commentary, I feel I should introduce it in the same way that Pierce Brosnan starts his own commentary on the DVD of the film. Okay, here we go. Die Another Day. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Press play now. So we are in the opening gun barrel with the very bombastic David Arnold titles, the confident Pierce Brosnan walk, and to let you know this is Die Another Day, you get the silver CG bullet coming down the gun barrel. To celebrate the silver 20th anniversary of the film, that's the 20th film, and unfortunately it's going to let you know right off the bat all the CG that's going to be rampant in the film. So we open in the pre-title sequence. This is set in North Korea, and we're immediately put in with this very desaturated look, which is done aesthetically on purpose. It was done in post digitally, so that's why it looks very weird and is very aggressively done. It does fit because this is North Korea, but in some places later on in the pre-titles, it does get a bit much. So this is the opening surfing sequence. Champion surfer Laird Hamilton leads a trio of surfers on these massive waves, which is, of course, incredibly dangerous. Made all the more impressive because, of course, they are doing this for real. The photography does make it a little bit confusing because you can't always see the entirety of the waves. And again, it is darkened to suggest the nighttime raid. So this is a very dangerous insertion mission, though why they had to surf instead of doing a halo jump as Bond did in Tomorrow Never Dies is beyond me. But I guess it's the film's first example of, wouldn't it be cool if Bond and co. surf into a secret mission? So after that impressive opening of amazing surfing done for real, we cut immediately to this shot here, which looks very ropey. Obviously, it's a process shot on the studio backlot, but even when this film came out, I noticed right off the bat this shot looked very weird, and there are, of course, many shots in the film that look terribly off or weird simply because of the processing or the digital work. But we immediately go into a very high-stakes seeming, very, on the edge of your seat secret mission. You can tell there's a desperation in Brosnan's performance here. And of course, he and his South Korean compatriots are speaking silently with hand signals and always looking over their shoulders, setting up the idea that this is a dangerous, almost suicide mission of sorts in North Korea. Of course, we don't know exactly what for yet, but it is setting up, along with the desaturated visuals, that this is very much more of a serious escapade for Bond than the traditional mini movie pre-title sequence that opens with a explosion and a smile. So in one of the film's many nods to the films that preceded it, here we have a nod from Goldfinger, the wetsuit opening to reveal perfectly dressed Bond, and the film will have dozens and dozens of these, some more obvious than others, but being the 20th film, it was felt that they had to make as many references as they could and fill the film with Easter eggs. They would do this in the future in other films, but here it is unfortunately rather obvious in a lot of places where it should be understated. Just like the film's other obvious thing that most reviewers commented on the original release, that the product placement is extremely heavy in the film, and again, very, very obvious, leading some to actually call it Buy Another Day instead of Die Another Day. This set that Peter Lamont designed for the Colonel Moon barracks and everything, it is very impressive and feels like it, of course, is in North Korea, although we have no idea what North Korea really looks like due to it being essentially closed off to the rest of the world. It feels perfect, and here I think the desaturation does work. Again, I really wish they hadn't done that. It's not really necessary, but again, it was done digitally instead of actually in the camera, so it makes it very much an aesthetic choice. That's why the sky is very gray and the skin tones are very subdued, but it is again trying to set up this intensity of, oh, this is a suicide mission and it's going to go wrong, and it's like, okay, we get the memo already. Introduced to Zhao for the first time, played by Rick Yoon, and the only time we see him with an unmarked face without diamonds stuck in it and with a head of hair. Of course, he was fresh off the first Fast and the Furious film, and of course, it would be another time the producers were wise to get people who had become hot in the industry at the time. Brosnan does really well with the opening sequence. Of course, you have Bond undercover, assuming an identity and having to piece together how he's supposed to act as the diamond trader Van Bierk. What's unfortunate is that William Lee, who plays Moon here, while this was pretty early on in his career, he does so well with the character that it's a shame he's only in the film for a certain period of time in the pre-title sequence, because of course we have the whole transition into Graves being the secretly still alive Moon. And, of course, another nod, I can't help but point out, the idea that Bond is facing a character called Colonel Moon has to be a nod to the first continuation novel, which was Kingsley Amis's Colonel Sun. And, of course, the full name of Moon eventually is given as Colonel Suntan Moon. So it's like an inversion of Colonel Sun. It is a cute gag, hiding weapons in the demilitarized zone by using hovercrafts to float over the landmines. It does have a Bondian flair and flourish to it, and I really don't have any problems with the opening title sequence. It is noticeably longer. It's not quite as long as The World Is Not Enough title, but it's pretty close. It actually clocks in over 13 minutes long before we hit the opening of Danny Kleinman's title sequence. So again, you can see Purvis and Wade trying to play around with the traditional building blocks of the Bond film formula, to whatever, if at all possible, to avoid the pre-title going into the opening of the film and the M briefing scene in the office, so on and so forth. While it's nice to freshen things up, it also means that, once again, we're not getting a traditionally flowing Bond film. It doesn't flow in the way a Bond film normally does. And really, we hadn't. GoldenEye did that a little bit, and License to Kill, of course, had done that because License to Kill was an experiment. So in a lot of ways, we haven't had a traditionally flowing James Bond film since The Living Daylights. So it's been quite a while. I like how this scene is played, and then suddenly this nice little beat of silence before Moon fires, and we know Bond has been blown. Again, the sound mix is extremely impressive. even in the pre-title sequence, it has moments of bombast that do help sell moments. We get a nice beat in David Arnold's score. I should mention Arnold's score for a bit here, because this was the second film that he was able to score after Tomorrow Never Dies. I should say second film he was able to score completely instead of piecemeal, because, again, Tomorrow Never Dies was his first Bond score, and he had to score it as the film was edited. So really, while Die Another Day is his third actual Bond score, it's the second score that he was able to write start to finish. It does build on a lot of the themes that he did in The World's Not Enough. Actually, some of those are semi-repeated and built upon or changed or tweaked in the score in various themes. It does, and it actually adds to the techno flavor of The World's Not Enough score, and really kind of overdoes it in a lot of places. It is a fine score with the film, but when you try to listen to it on its own, it does get a bit overbearing at times. But it is building on what we heard in The World Is Not Enough and has great moments in it. I think it's having to pump itself up. I think Arnold is trying to match the sheer bombast of the film that's going on, and I think that's why the score can feel so overbearing at times. Now, this action automatically makes you think to the opening of Tomorrow Never Dies. The second unit was handled once again by Vic Armstrong. But here, I like it because it's cut a bit tighter, and Brosnan looks fantastic as he takes over the hovercraft and just really sells the sequence. He has such assurance as he does small things like blast the gate lock so it smashes off the hovercraft behind him. And this is not easy material for any actor to do. Brosnan had a very tough time shooting this film because, of course, there was very little prep time for him. He had made the very small drama Evelyn for his own production company before immediately jumping into Die Another Day. And then when he did the run for the hovercraft in that sequence, he actually tore his knee significantly. So he did the rest of the film with an injured knee. And, of course, one can only take one's hat off to him for managing to carry on through a mammoth production after that point, but he still carries it off with absolute assurance. Even in the little moments like that there where he empties the little submachine gun, I've always loved how he immediately dumps it to the side without even looking. Something else I should note, you do see it in little bits even in the pre-title sequence. Everybody likes to complain about the CG in the film, but the films still did utilize John Richardson's model unit. There are some nice model shots in the film, which, again, if you talked about models in regards to Die Another Day, I think most people would think you were crazy, but there is good model work and great practical effects work, which unfortunately gets overshadowed again by the CG work, which does come into play with some really iffy-looking shots towards the end of this sequence coming up. Here's one there. Even all of the what would normally in the old days be a rear projection shot, here it's done digitally, and it just looks extraordinarily flat behind the actors in the live footage. I do like how they build in Bondian elements and moments for Bond to use his wit. So, of course, he takes out the driver. Earlier, he shot the fragmentation jumping landmine. Here he uses the bulletproof vest until Moon empties the pistol. And will, of course, use the hovercraft to actually overcome Moon. And, of course, it's fitting he uses his own weapons against him. Again, you can see just how ropey the shots look with all these backgrounds. Digital effects work had been around and was, first used in a Bond film in GoldenEye, but the effects were folded into the practical work pretty seamlessly in the first three films of the Brosnan tenure. But here you can really see it poking through even in the pre-titles. So unfortunately, this is the end of Moon Mark 1. And this would normally be the point at which the pre-title sequence would end. But no, we have to be very edgy here, and this is Bond going somewhere different. Some people complain about the Saved by the Bell one-liner and that the one-liners in the film are a little bit underbaked and underdeveloped. I can totally see that. I think they work, but again, I don't think they always have that Bondian flair to them fully. Now, normally a pre-title sequence would end there or Bond making a quick exit, but of course he's winded here, and that gives enough time for Moon's father to show up and capture him. Moon's father is played by the wonderful Kenneth Tsang, who you will probably know from a number of the great John Woo Hong Kong action classics, who unfortunately is not in the film very much. Now, Arnold's score goes for this very striking vibe, and it leads us into the torture sequence with those discordant notes. So we get to see a little bit of the torture sequence with actual footage, and then we're transitioned into Danny Kleinman's title sequence with the theme song performed by Madonna, which very quickly became a extremely divisive element of the film within the fan base and audiences and critics at large. It is generally regarded as one of the worst songs in the series, which I feel is kind of unfortunate. It is a dance track. It is very experimental. It is very anti the traditional idea of a Bond theme, but I have to admit, I've never had a major problem with it. I think it fits thematically, and I think it goes with Kleinman's title sequence beautifully. But I will admit, I do think what really makes the song for me and what makes the song in general is the string section. All the string arrangements are what make it more than just a dance track. There are some moments like this, Sigmund Freud analyzed this, that are, a bit much. I think it works, though. I think the string section humanizes the song and adds to the notion of Bond's struggle through remaining stoic and not breaking in the extended torture sequence, which, again, we're only seeing in the title sequence, which is giving the idea of the passage of time, because Bond films typically shy away from doing things like that where they have extended passages of time. The only time we had any sort of montage like that before this really was in Honor Majesty's Secret Service, where Peter Hunt had to find a way to convey Bond and Tracy's deepening relationship, which he did over the song We Have All the Time in the World. So this title sequence really is doing that same idea, but using it to convey Bond's 14 months being tortured in North Korea, and somehow not only not breaking, but surviving and not dying a horrible death. Again, I really have to hand it to Danny Kleinman here. Coming up with the traditional Bond elements, but doing it in the actual torture sequence footage and making it work with the Madonna title song, I think it's exceptionally put together. It is extremely creative and is easily the best usage of CGI in the entire film. In fact, I think it's the only great usage of CGI in the entire film. This is my favorite moment of the song here, which they put over David Arnold's credit. And then this amazing shot where Brosnan rises up that goes perfectly timed to the point at which the string section really rises. So, again, I think there are great elements to this song that have unfortunately gotten overlooked because it is so abrasive. I can understand people not liking it and just rejecting it outright, but I do think it works thematically, and I think it's spot on as a thematic song. And so that's why I've never had problems with it. The one problem I do have with the title sequence is right here. Again, like Tomorrow Never Dies, Lee Tamahori's director's credit is in the actual film, but at least it's at the very, very end of the titles, and it's not actually on its own card like Roger Spottiswood's credit was in Tomorrow Never Dies. It's a minor thing, I know, but a Bond director credit should never be outside of the title sequence. So here is Bond in his Robinson Crusoe mode, so we see his look after 14 months of torture. To be quite honest, he doesn't look completely half bad. I think if anyone survived this same amount of torture, they probably would look much worse if they had somehow survived. If you look closely at Brosnan's performance, he really does excellent things with this to really convey what Bond has gone through. You can see in his face he can't even hold his head straight without quivering. He's literally shaking, but he still manages to hold on to that element of Bond's stoicism and even work in a few quips, even though it's Bond battered to within an inch of his life. He still managed to hold on to that core of himself, which is, of course, what has made him be able to last these 14 months. And really, the cruelty of this essentially framing of Bond as having cracked and hemorrhaging information, as M later says, the cruelty of this in the villain's plot is that Bond has survived this and been a hero, as Falco later cruelly observes. You think he's some kind of a hero. He has been a hero, but in the eyes of his own people and the rest of the world, that has been stripped away. And of course, his 00 status will be stripped away very shortly thereafter as well. So it's Bond being humiliated, which is unfortunately something that I think gets often overlooked. But on the flip side of that, when you think about the villain's plot, you have to wonder, was it all important to get Zhao out? Because if Bond had been left to rot in North Korea, Graves' plan would have probably worked. So I don't think it helps to try and examine Die Another Day's plotting all too logically. Like The World's Not Enough, the more closely you look at it, the more things start to fall apart and the more holes you can poke in it. But here, it's much more obvious than it was in The World's Not Enough. Now, this setup, of course, is to try to get a last moment to try and trick information out of Bond, to get him to let something go, because Moon is setting this up to make it look like Bond is going to be executed in front of a firing squad. And so it's a bit of sleight of hand, because we, the audience, are being led by Tamahori, the director, and Purvis and Wade, the writers, into thinking that, okay, how is Bond going to escape a firing squad? But of course, it's actually a prisoner exchange, hence the gigantic wall of fog behind them at this point. If you notice, we're not being shown much of the bridge area until Bond turns around, and still it's held relatively close to, again, make the reveal a bit of a surprise. None of this is confirmed until we hear the obvious English-sounding voice over the intercom saying, "Keep walking." And then you see the figure come out of the fog, which of course is Zhao, revealing that this is a prisoner exchange. This is really the last point where we have the desaturation of the image. As soon as the film leaves North Korea, this goes away and we go to the film untouched by digital recolor timing. You do have a little bit of this come back when the film eventually gets back to North Korea by the ending, but it's really confined to the opening segment in North Korea. It is a bit strange, admittedly, that Zhao still has all the diamonds in his face. It's never explained why those wouldn't be removed, as obviously that would be not only painful, but hazardous to one's health to be walking around with diamonds stuck in your face. Here we're introduced to Michael Madsen as Falco, the head of the NSA. Of course, Madsen had worked with Tamahori before, was actually a friend and neighbor of Pierce Brosnan's, and he has this wonderful vibe he carries into any film that he's in. I think it's unfortunate that he's cast as the Falco character. I think he would have made actually a quite interesting Felix Leiter for Brosnan's Bond. They do have an interesting chemistry, and the idea of them being, friendly next-door neighbors is appealing in and of itself. But the more I think about it, I think it would have been so much more interesting and appealing for this story, particularly at this point with Bond really being an outsider within his own world, to have the person he interacts with be a rougher, coarser Felix Leiter played by Michael Madsen. So this is a very high-techy sci-fi examination of Bond's body. Again, playing up the whole notion of Bond always being 2 minutes into the future. Well, here in Die Another Day, we do get frequently into science fiction territory. So, of course, it can't just be a traditional examination. I do like the line acknowledging Bond's alcohol intake, so the line about the liver. There are some nice Bondian flourishes and moments of Fleming. Here is one here that most people are not going to pick up on, but I think it was Purvis and Wade making a beautiful direct pull from Fleming. And that is, of course, the glass wall that separates Bond and M in this sequence, which makes sense story-wise, because, of course, Bond at this point has just been pulled out of North Korea. It's unknown if he's been brainwashed, and so the glass wall is a protective measure, which very nicely he only spots once he gets up and gets his bearings, and then Brosnan puts his hand out and we see the reflections. But the glass wall is it's an idea taken from the opening of Fleming's final Bond novel, The Man with the Golden Gun, where Bond does show up after being presumed dead, and he's been brainwashed by the Russians to kill M. And M manages to use a protective glass shield that crashes down on the top of his desk to protect him from Bond's brainwashed poison attack. And then Bond is eventually taken away and deprogrammed and has to get on his feet again. So in a lot of ways, I think what Purvis and Wade did was they took that idea, reworked it, but kept some of those same thematics. And here with the glass wall, we have the physical manifestation of where that came from. So for me, I really think Die Another Day is, if you took the opening of the novel The Man with the Golden Gun, but changed it to North Korea and made it a spy getting betrayed and having to go out to clear his name instead of Bond being brainwashed, but then that's grafted onto essentially a remake of the Moonraker plot, of the novel plot. So it's really taking a lot of Fleming material, but grafting it into a new place and time, but taking the opening of one book and the main body of another book that had never been used and just sort of grafting that opening onto the Moonraker novel plot. It's a brilliant concept. I think it was a great idea. Unfortunately, I don't think it was fleshed out or finessed enough. And it's not helped by Tamahori coming in and cranking everything up to 11. Again, here, I think the performances are fine, and I like what Brosnan and Judi Dench are doing with their traditional established Bond-M relationship, and having to be ridiculously tough with Bond. And, of course, completely within her rights to do so, because Bond is an unknown factor at this point. He seems pretty much okay, but obviously he's still shaken by the events that have just unfolded. My favorite parts of the opening chunk of the film, if you want to call it that, is Bond having to use his ingenuity. He doesn't have any Q branch gadgets. He's having to rely on his own wit and instincts. So, of course, he has to break out of the facility. Now, there you see the first of the film's major speed ramps, that little bit there where the camera tracks over to the bed, but it speeds up and slows down at the same time. You're going to see a number of those throughout the film, along with a lot of slow-mo effects applied. This film was edited by Christian Wagner primarily, who had edited films for Tony Scott, and he had just come off of editing Mission Impossible 2 for John Woo and Tom Cruise. So if you've seen Mission Impossible 2 and you know how the editing gets there and how John Woo loves to use slow-motion work, it becomes very obvious that Wagner applied a lot of this stuff and a lot of modern cutting to a Bond film, which fit perfectly with what Lee Tamahori was trying to do. And Wagner has gone on since to edit many of the Fast and the Furious films. So that's another thing that Die Another Day really irritates me with, is that it moves differently and it's trying to be flashy in its editing, and it really doesn't work. Bond stopping his heart to a crawl is very over the top, but at least it's him using ingenuity to escape something. Now there in Arnold's Kiss of Life cue, if you listen very carefully, you can hear the actual original electronic effects that open the Dr. No gun barrel. It's one of the film's, again, mini nods to the earlier films and the past. That one I really like because it is subtle, it's buried in the mix, but once you spot it, it's very charming. This shot here of the harbor looks very ropey. I've never liked it. And then especially when we see Bond's hand come up and it's obviously he's covered in grimy water, it looks very ropey. But again, Brosnan is playing it for everything it's worth. This is one of the great jokes of the film, Bond waltzing in, dressed horribly, dripping in scuzzy water with the barely trimmed beard into the fancy yacht club, but strutting in with the usual Bond assurance, and Arnold's cue goes for a nice winking, ritzy feel of the Bond theme. And I think they would take this gag and play it for all it was worth later on with Brosnan in the film The Matador. Now, one of my favorite things in Raymond Benson's novelization was he added a whole extra sequence where Bond escapes from the British ship and then has a whole almost Jason Bourne, I should say the Ludlum Jason Bourne of the novels moment, where he manages to find elements of the criminal underworld in the back streets of Seoul, because they're still in South Korea, and manages to pickpocket some criminals' money and get enough for some food and some clothes, and then bribe his way onto a British warship and smuggles himself into Hong Kong, and then does this scene in strutting into the yacht club looking the worse for wear. So that's a beautiful bit of character and spycraft, and has a nice bit of travelogue feel to it. It's a very small thing, but I love that sequence so much, and I wish it was in the film, because it seems very easy for Bond to just walk in and do this in the hotel. But of course, the film has to move along, and I can understand why they would not have a sequence like that. I don't know if that's in a draft of a screenplay or if it's something Benson added, but it's a particular point I love in the novelization. Now, of course, Bond doing all of this, he's manipulating who he knows is obviously Chinese intelligence, and it is actual spycraft going on. He knows, of course, that Hong Kong has already been handed over to the Chinese, and the Chinese will naturally suspect that he's there on some sort of mission to strike back for England or something. Number of nods here, of course. Peaceful Fountains of Desire has the small gun on a garter belt holster, like Pam in License to Kill, and Chang with a number of guys are in there videotaping secretly the escapades about to happen behind glass, which is a nod to From Russia with Love. Again, this scene is wonderful when you think about the implications, and Bond is playing as if at first, he's still an MI6 agent, but here he basically reveals himself to Chang and Chinese intelligence that he's essentially gone rogue and he's out for revenge, and he's tracing Zhao for his own personal means. Get me to North Korea, I'll take care of him for you. He even gives the gun back, which is the ultimate sign of trust, so he's now once again unarmed. Now, apparently an early idea was to have this entire sequence dealing with Wei Lin, and so Michelle Yeoh would make a cameo returning from her role in Tomorrow Never Dies, but that was dropped and we got Mr. Chang instead. I like that extra moment there of Brosnan taking his hand. You can see Bond is obviously thinking about what he's just done and how he's going to proceed further. Now we have this scene here with Mr. Chang, who is all smiles, which is just a beautiful moment for this character. He's barely in this film, but he leaves such an impression, and I like the idea of the yacht club hotel manager actually being Chinese intelligence for some reason. And the fact that they've traced Zhao to Cuba, and they just get Bond a plane ticket, and it's like, thank you, please leave. So we have this really effective smash cut to what is ostensibly Havana. If you look very closely coming up here, there is one of the great Michael G. Wilson producer cameos. He's standing in front of a car there in the white shirt with the cowboy hat as Brosnan walks by. He has a cameo later in the film. That one's very quick, and I didn't notice it for the longest time. Now, this is another moment where I once again have to completely bow down to Peter Lamont. You would completely think this film was shot here in Cuba, but of course, due to the U.S. embargo, that was an impossibility. So they wound up shooting mostly in Spain, but then also once Bond walks back into the buildings, they're actually back on the backlot at Pinewood. So nothing was shot in Cuba, and it just feels and looks incredible. Again, it's another example of where Peter Lamont completely goes above and beyond and fully realizing a real-life environment where it was obviously impossible for them to shoot at the time. I also like the gag that Purvis and Wade have come up here. Of course, Cuba is stuck in a period of time, so Bond is going to the pre-existing MI6 man or contact in Cuba, but using a recognition code that goes back decades because no one has ever come here and used it. So Bond is using things that are out of date, much like he himself already feels. And we get an actual recognition code here with Raoul and the Delectado cigars, so it is another nod to the From Russia with Love type of spycraft with an actual back and forth multi-part recognition code. Of course, the Bond films in the Brosnan era had been pretty much anti-smoking, and here it was deemed okay because they're in Cuba ostensibly, and Cuban cigars are part of the national heritage of the country. So it was fitting that Bond would smoke a Havana cigar while in Havana, because otherwise it would seem perhaps insensitive to not promote the most famous part of the country's culture that is known throughout the rest of the world. And I do like that touch. I love the character of Raoul. He is very much in the Karen Bay mold, and it is a damn shame that he's in so little of the film. I love his dialogue with Bond. This scene here where he's called in a few favors, a few dollars spread around, and he manages to find where Zhao is, and there's all these wonderful little references to the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution and how everything is a bit hypocritical at this point in the country's politics, things like that. It's very wink wink, and there's another wink wink moment here where, of course, Bond picks up a book, and of course it's a copy of Field Guide to Birds of the West Indies. But of course the author's name is very conveniently smudged out because, of course, the author was American ornithologist James Bond. And that, of course, was the novel Fleming had on his bookshelf in his Jamaican home of Goldeneye, and where he spotted the name when he was searching for the character name when writing Casino Royale in 1953. It's also a nice touch that Bond only has a pair of binoculars and an old revolver. The revolver idea was Tamahori's, and that's my favorite idea in the film, that Bond has to go that far back in terms of hardware. The ultimate joke here is the fast car is a beautiful old Ford, which I believe is meant to be the same make and model as the Ford we see Bond in with Mr. Jones and Dr. No. Of course, it's not black, but it's literally the same make of car. So that's another nod to an earlier film in the series. But that bit there with, I could do with the fast car, Raoul sort of smiling, and then the wonderfully triumphant David Arnold cue, for me, is the best joke in the entire film, and always gets a wonderful, knowing laugh. So at this point in the film, we're starting to get a rhythm and things, but it's coming up to the 35, 36-minute mark as Bond enters the bar, and he's starting to observe the, as they'll be called later, the predators, basically all of the criminal underworld that have somehow, for some reason, navigated to around Los Organos. So it's a nice bit of setup, a nice bit of local flavor and things. But for me, this is really the point at which the film starts to go off the rails. And it becomes pretty obvious why in just a moment. But this is the point where the science fiction fantasy is about to start to creep in with the beauty parlor and the DNA replacement therapy. But where my cringe factor really starts with this film is with the appearance of Jinx here, in a extraordinarily overdone homage to Ursula Andress coming out on the beach in Dr. No in the iconic white bikini. While I don't have a problem with reprising that idea, it's drawn out and done with slow motion and overplayed, and David Arnold's cue is extremely lush and things. So it's very on the nose. But my whole problem is with the Jinx character. It's basically a character that's nothing but never-ending walking cliches, and again dialed up to 11. It's not Halle Berry's fault, and it took me a long time to be able to see her in anything else and not think of this film and this character. But it's basically taking the archetype, essentially really started in The Spy Who Loved Me with Anya, and really formalized in the Brosnan era by Wei Lin and Tomorrow Never Dies, of the Bond's equal female agent character, but ramping it up to a point that it becomes an actual annoyance every time she's on screen, because she's always got a pithy comeback, and she's so much drawn as the female Bond that it becomes to a point that you know what the character is, and you don't need to be told repeatedly over and over and over again. And Jinx actually does things that cause mistakes and things, and is not necessarily the greatest agent, and doesn't reveal a lot of pertinent information and things, and actually takes the focus away from Bond frequently, which is another example of Bond sort of taking a backseat reactionary role in a Bond film. So while I don't have a problem with the actress or the character's role in the story at large, it's the sheer annoyance the character causes that really drives me nuts. And this dialogue here has always felt a little stilted, but I guess Bond is a little bit rusty in his romantic encounters at this point. We do get a nice little nod from Rush with Love where Bond introduces himself as "my friends call me James Bond," which I do appreciate. Now, here is one of my major problems with the film. Tamahori decided to push the love scene to the point of really making it vivid and much more raw and showing actual movement and sweaty faces and things. This caused a number of censorship problems. So here I'm looking at the U.S. cut, which is slightly trimmed from what was shown in pretty much the rest of the world, but particularly the U.K. and Europe. It's not a major edit, but there are some minor edits here. This is where subtlety is really required. Bond love scenes famously never show anything. We got a tantalizing glimpse of more connection when we saw Bond and Elektra in bed and The World Is Not Enough, which I really appreciated. But here, all that subtlety is gone, and it makes you squirm in your seat a little bit. And then we have the added extra knife play for some reason, setting up the notion of, is Jinx good or bad, which we'll return to by the very end fade out of the film. Now, this shot here with the champagne flutes is very nice, but then you see more movement in the background, which pretty much wrecks the shot, and all subtlety is gone. But what I hate most of all is this shot here of Bond waking up alone, which suggests Tracy and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is the only time we've ever seen Bond be so overwhelmed by a romantic conquest that he has overslept and the woman in question has left him alone in the hotel room. So it's a nod to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but it's also very heavily suggesting that Jinx is like a superwoman of sorts and such a great character, and to even inference in any way that Jinx is as strong a character as Tracy was in OHMSS just really irks me. And some of my favorite moments in the Bond series have always been Bond slipping away in the middle of the night, leaving the gorgeous woman in bed alone, because of course Bond is a loner and is always performing some sort of detective work, like he does here. And we get this very cute gag of Bond punching out the very nasty Mr. Krug and having the poor girl who's had to spend the night with him just, nonchalantly look up. And the nice payoff is Bond pushing the very unconscious Krug in a wheelchair. And of course, it's a nice bit of Bond ingenuity using this as a cover to get inside the clinic, or at least the respectable low-rent version of the clinic. Something I should mention here, probably, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about the photography of the film. The film was shot by the cinematographer David Tattersall while he was doing the Star Wars prequels. He shot all 3 Star Wars prequels, and he did Die Another Day, I believe, after he finished Attack of the Clones. Of course, that was shot entirely digitally. Here, I think he gives everything a nice color and things, but it almost gives it a science fiction-y vibe in a lot of places, which fits the over-the-top fantasy science fiction elements the film deals with, but it also kind of gets away from the grounding and reality of a Bond film. So it's definitely one of the most colorful and one of the most vivid Bond films. It's also kind of hurt because I'm sure they probably use a digital intermediate, and I don't think this film has ever gotten like a brand new 4K scan of the actual film elements, so I think maybe that might help at some point. I should also point out one of my favorite Bond nods was earlier when Bond goes out of the room, he plucks a grape off of the plate, which is, of course, a nod to Bond doing the same thing in Count Lippe's room in Thunderball. So Bond going through the secret door here is where we get the first element of Fantasyland. So we have the twirling mirrors with the DNA helixes. I can't help but think the twirling mirrors are perhaps supposed to be a nod to Scaramouche's Funhouse and the Man with the Golden Gun. This is Dr. Alvarez, who is presented as a rather creepy fellow in a way, creepy in the implications of his DNA replacement therapy. While I like the idea of a secret Cuban clinic perhaps being able to do things that medical science doesn't recognize, the whole scientific explanation of this DNA replacement therapy doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you question it. And, of course, it begs the question, why didn't the villain just have extensive plastic surgery? We had already done that in Thunderball with the Spectre plot. And then rather coldly, Jinx just assassinates the Doctor here, which is kind of strange how cold-bloodedly that is played off. But it's dialed down because we cut away very fast. We don't see any blood, obviously, it being a PG-13 rated film. But it is showing that, of course, Jinx is an agent of sorts, which we already kind of figured out. But she obviously has her own mission and decides to not let Bond in on any of it. Another touch I really do like in this sequence is Bond is going around and we hear the various voices, because not only are people getting makeovers, they're getting language makeovers. And he has to go around until he finds the room where he's hearing Korean being spoken. And obviously it's being brought over into what seems like German for Zal's final appearance. But as you see, he goes through the various rooms. We hear English, we hear German, we hear other languages, but only one room do you hear ostensibly a Korean voice. And by Jinx pulling up Zal's file, we're able to get a visual reference for why he looks so weird, because he's in the middle of this DNA replacement process. And I like that Bond is having to piece all this together. Again, we have Bond with an old-fashioned revolver in the middle of all this high-tech machinery. And the nice touch of grabbing the IV bag to make Zal wake up very quickly. Nice bit of intensity in Brosnan's performance. But instead of getting a nice confrontation scene, we get a pretty nice little fight, actually, that very nicely uses all the elements of the room, very much like the kitchen fight scene in The Living Daylights. Unfortunately, we have one of these bits of slow-mo here, which really plays up on getting the bullet necklace, which will, of course, have the diamonds in it, but it was really unnecessary. The MRI machine kicking on and bringing all the metal objects and the blades to it is a nice touch. And then we immediately get the rubbing out the bottle of alcohol getting lit on fire, which causes the fire. So it builds nicely. It's a nice little fight. I wish it was a little longer and didn't have that bit of forced slow-mo in there. Once again, Brosnan's Bond is walking down a hallway completely soaked, so it makes you flash back to MI6 and The World Is Not Enough. You would think Jinx would say something about her bomb charge, but of course not. Let's let Bond walk into it. Now, of course, when they get back out onto the exterior with the helipad, it's a mixture. This whole sequence is a mixture of locations. The actual island was real, but then they only used part of the building, and the rest was effects work. And then the interiors were, of course, sets. And then this here was back out on a different location. So it's a nicely put together mixture of locations and blended well. Bond's methodology of blowing a hole in the wall is overblown, but it is it is overblown to the point that it's nice in a way that this huge cloud of smoke comes up and Bond blows a hole through the wall with what seems to be a nitrogen tank. Again, another Arnold cue that is going for bombast to match the sequence as being seen. Now here comes one of the most notorious awful CG shots. This shot where you can already see now we've cut to a digital background behind Halle Berry. Now she has a pink bikini instead of the orange one. But when we do the pullback, the reverse pullback where she bends over backwards, it's horrendous in terms of effects work. And what makes it even more unfortunate, it's a, seemingly, 200 or more foot back dive into water, which immediately makes you think of the iconic GoldenEye bungee jump from the pre-title sequence, which of course was done for real. So already in just the space of a few short years, we've gone from one astounding jump done for real to this one, which was completely faked. But I like that we have a moment to catch our breath for Bond to think and get a new piece of the mystery by opening the bullet and finding inside some diamonds. And Arnold's cue has a bit of the traditional, more military-flavored rendition of the Bond theme, which is him sort of referencing John Barry and almost maybe a little flash of You Only Live Twice there. Now we have, unfortunately, our last scene with Raoul where they examine the diamonds and find the marking of the Graves mine. We get a little bit more about the African conflict diamonds. I like how Bond puts this together very, very quickly, but manages to come up with his conclusion while smoking a Havana cigar. Genetically identical to African conflict diamonds. How convenient. What an amazing coincidence. Again, showing Bond's ingenuity, and he's going to be following that hunch for the rest of the film. And of course, that hunch proves to be correct, which is why M decides to reinstate him. So again, showing Bond's ingenuity is always the way to go. I also like the little bit of spycraft here that's inherent in this scene, because with Falco's dialogue, he's suggesting that Bond intentionally torched the clinic, to use the words that he uses in the scene, and is obviously not talking about his own agent. So he's playing it up as if it was entirely Bond's doing, that he's completely uncontrollable. Now, this scene is important for a number of reasons. First of all, the stewardess that's giving Bond his martini is played by Roger Moore's daughter, making a nice cameo. Bond saying, "Lucky I asked for it shaken," is a nod to the shaking drinks that were cut out of the M briefing scene in Tomorrow Never Dies. Unfortunately, Tamahori decided to use a needle drop of The Clash's London Calling, which is the first time that's ever happened in a Bond film and really doesn't fit, even though I'm a giant Clash fan. Now, there was a scene they dropped there. You have to wonder, how did Bond get into England and not get noticed by MI6, who has the entire world branches looking for him? Well, originally what he did was sneak through a trapdoor hatch and actually come out on the plane landing gear. So you'd see the plane landing and the front wheel had Bond hanging on the inside of it. And then once it landed, he would crawl out and sneak away and be able to join the press corps waiting for Gustav Graves. So it was a matching sequence where we saw Bond enter London via plane wheel, and then we cut to Graves making an entrance, of course, with a Union Jack parachute as a nod to The Spy Who Loved Me, which is, of course, meant to suggest his ego and his, PR stunts to promote his British culture and his promotion of the British way, which is, of course, going into the rather underplayed idea that he's given away all this money to charity, which is also coming from Drax and the Moonraker novel, because, of course, Graves is a reworking, essentially is the Hugo Drax character from Fleming's novel, who, of course, was a Nazi who had his face blown off by a grenade and then had plastic surgery and reinvented himself and made his own fortune by various criminal means, and then developed a rocketry program which he was going to donate to England, so they were going to knight him, and then he decided to instead actually his plan was to have it crash and destroy London itself as the ultimate revenge. So essentially, when you know that and you've read Moonraker, you can see where they were going with this, and it is essentially using the Moonraker novel plot that had never been turned into a film. And going with that idea, this is the point at which the film completely becomes the Moonraker novel adaptation as a Bond film. And so this sequence with the fencing in the Gentleman's Club is essentially the card game meeting between Bond and Drax from Moonraker in the Club of Blades, where Bond goes with M to find that Hugo Drax is, or I should say, Sir Hugo Drax is cheating at cards. While a card game is obviously much less cinematic, it is a gripping, riveting scene. It's one of the best Bond villain confrontations in all of Fleming's work. It's one of the highlights of the novel, but it is very subtle. It's all about card play and character, and Bond, as usual, puncturing the villain character on civil terms. Here, we get that in the swordplay, but as you will quickly see, that gets dialed up to 11 by basically destroying the entire club and eventually winding up using broadswords. This is the much-discussed cameo from Madonna, who, of course, was given a small cameo in the film after doing the title song. It's a minor, tiny little thing. I've never had an issue with it. It's a blink and you miss it and over with. Yes, some of the dialogue is a bit, silly and punny, but again, it's a minor thing. It's a cameo. It could be worse. I never had an issue with it, so I don't know why so many people make such a big issue out of the Madonna cameo. So again, this is the traditional Bond and villain meeting on civil terms in public. But automatically we're given a slightly off vibe. But as soon as Graves meets Bond, he says, "Have we met before?" And of course, hinting at there is something under the surface other than, screaming, "This is Bond villain." Now, Graves is played by Toby Stephens, who already at this time, even though he was much younger in his career, was already a noted stage actor. And unfortunately, I don't think he's served very well by the film because he's having to play slight variations on the same character. So he has to play the bluster and the bravado that the Graves persona is. But of course, he is actually the Moon we thought was dead in the pre-title sequence. Obviously, post-DNA replacement therapy and the sort of mental breakdowns that has caused in addition to insomnia. So already it has taken somebody who was slightly unhinged and probably made them much more completely unhinged. And then on top of that, in scenes like this, you see the false character, but then you see the anger and the rage and the insanity start to break through in little moments. So I like what he's trying to bring to this part, but unfortunately, it doesn't always come across, and it's usually for not really much of a reason. That's why he's putting on all these sneers and things. It's supposed to make the audience wrinkle a little bit, and he's right to do so. I feel the Graves character really isn't developed enough. And it took me a while to read into this stuff because I had to really start to think about it. Okay, what is the motivation here? What is he doing? And once I made the Drax parallel, it all makes sense because, again, Graves is a reworking of Fleming's Drax, who does the same thing and has reinvented himself. And here we have a traditional Bond moment where Bond makes himself look the loser to make the villain overplay his hand. Here he does literally, and Bond manages to actually give him a flesh wound on the wrist. But you can already see a certain intensity building that we don't normally get at this point in the first Bond villain confrontation. Bond can see that Graves has issues, most assuredly. I have to mention really quickly there, Brosnan kicking the sword there was an actual on-set improvisation and flew towards the camera and almost hit the poor stills photographer. And I like that the sound mix actually added a little tiny sound effect for that. But again, to go back to this, there is an intensity already because now they're actually using blades that Graves has grabbed off the wall. They're already, inflicting damage on each other. So already we've moved past the traditional standard fencing. But again, there's not much subtlety in this scene. Everything is cranked up to 11. Already we're going outside of the fencing room. Now we're in the hallway. We've got a sword fight that's got body blows. The nice shot of Bond going over the chair was, of course, used in all the trailers. And now we've got passersby and innocent civilians, and now we're destroying the priceless artworks and things. It's a nice sequence. It's probably the best action sequence in the film. And there's no CG work. It builds in intensity because we have the whole notion of upping the weapons. So Graves continually grabs a different weapon, and then Bond has to match him somehow. So he grabs the katana there, and now we transition to the final broadswords, which, while is completely impractical, it shows Graves's bloodlust in the moment. We get the nice clanging on the soundtrack of the sound effect of the blades, and shows just the ridiculous level this fight has gotten to. So again, I really do think this is the most effective action sequence in the film, but it shows how the whole film is continually revving everything up to just completely overwhelm the audience and wow a certain grouping of a younger market used to more intensive, constant film sequences to try and make Bond appeal to the youth market. And you lose that important subtlety of essentially, this is the Goldfinger golf game. So, imagine the golf game in Goldfinger if all of a sudden, that was cranked up to the level of intensity we see here and condensed down. You lose that back and forth psychological play between Bond and villain, which is essential for this type of sequence. You have flashes of it here, so it still works, but it loses its potency because it's so ramped up. So it actually would have been, I think, better to have a version of the card game in the novel, because the what made that scene so interesting is that Hugo Drax was cheating at cards simply because he had to win, not because he needed the money. And it was a potential social and political scandal, which you don't have that here. Although we do get some nice bits of humor. We see the destroyed things being carried up. And then I love this gag of inside the gentleman's club, we have the attendant here, played by the lovely fellow with the dreadlocks, which seems incongruous to the scenario being presented. And we're introduced to the character of Miranda Frost, who was originally supposed to be the character of Gala Brand from the Moonraker novel, who was a undercover MI5 agent. But I'm thankful they didn't make her Gala Brand, because Gala Brand was not a traitorous villainess as Miranda Frost is. But they did keep her Gala's original iciness towards Bond. That was part of her cover, and basically turned that into the entire character. Now, this is one of my favorite sequences in the whole film. This whole notion of the abandoned station for abandoned agents. Bond gets the package in the club. Obviously, I suppose since Miranda is MI6, she notified M, hey, James Bond just showed up. And so they sent him the package with just the key inside. And Bond knows what it means and decides that he has to play by whatever game M is playing by. So at this point, he's not 007. He's having to figure out where he stands, not just with the rest of the world as he's been doing, but now he has to figure out how he stands with not just MI6, but with M herself. And this setting of the abandoned London railway station being taken over and used by MI6 for various purposes, one of them being for confronting abandoned or burned agents, is just a beautiful, fascinating, wonderful concept that feels like it actually has to have happened somewhere. And again, Peter Lamont's set design, it feels like a real location. It's beautifully done. It's so detailed that I'm so glad that we actually get many more cutaways to this, because, of course, the version of Q's lab we see in the film is here. So we will flash back to this setting. But I've always felt this is one of those sets that we don't get to see enough of. It's, again, I just love the whole idea of this. And I like that M is playing this close to her chest, because this whole time she still has believed in Bond and is right to do so, because he has a lead on Graves that no one else has come up with. And thus it proves his intuition was spot on and correct, and that she was right to believe in her top agent when no one else did. But she can't just officially come out and say at first, oh, well, I'm reinstating him. No, she has to bring him in from the cold in this way. It's a great way to work real spycraft into a Bond film experience, which traditionally is much more about action and adventure instead of the hard-boiled, much more John le Carre spycraft. So I really appreciate when we get things like that in the films, and that is something that I have always felt Purvis and Wade in their screenplays have tried to do, and I really appreciate it. Here we have the opposite of that. This is the VR training sequence, and Tamahori went out of his way to direct it as if it was a video game. So Bond looks very emotionless, and it is manipulating the audience once again. We see Moneypenny with a bullet wound in her head, which made audience members gasp when this film first came out. But again, from the coldness of this sequence and the way Bond doesn't react, and Tamahori admitted he tried to shoot this literally like a third-person and first-person shooter with different camera angles and things to, again, try and capture the youth market who were, in his idea, great video gamers, so they would enjoy something like this. It's a cute idea, but I hate the manipulation aspect of it because it cheapens it. It's obviously just a modernized firing range, and now we get that revealed here with John Cleese's Q coming in to the actual sequence, and actually a really nice little effect. That is the one moment of slow-mo when we see the VR goon freeze in sort of a Matrix-style effect. So here, again, as I mentioned before, this is the Q Lab section of the Underground Railway area. Now, this is where you will want to freeze frame the film, because here, as Bond says, they keep the old relics. So this room is literally filled with dozens, if not hundreds, of props from the earlier films. We only get to see a few of them, but it's a tantalizing what if in terms of imagining what it's like to go through the Eon archives. So we see, of course, the Thunderball rocket belt, Rosa Kleb's shoe from Russia with Love. We see the attaché case. We see the crocodile sub from Octopussy. We see the wings of the Acrostar jet. So many things. But then it's also used to introduce the new gadgets of the film. What I really enjoy about this sequence, and I feel is another shame that it never happened again, here John Cleese has figured out the handle on how to do Q after Desmond Llewellyn's passing. In The World's Not Enough, he first appeared as R, and they had him in his first appearance play it up for laughs and act kind of buffoonish. At the very end of the film, he appears and does the whole traditional Q-style final line, as Desmond did iconically in films like Moonraker. And there, he doesn't have that buffoonish quality. Here, he's got a handle on the character, or at least the producers and the writers figured out what they wanted him to do. And he has just the slightest tinge of a crustiness, and finds a way to beautifully re-render the traditional Desmond Llewellyn Q Bond relationship with the Q crustiness that just barely hides the fact that we know Q adores Bond, but he can never admit that. And I really appreciate that they went to the lengths of making a new character that still fit the mold enough of what Desmond established, but never insulted the audience to say, this is going to completely redo what Desmond Llewellyn had done so well before. And I really hate that this was the last time that John Cleese did the role because, again, I looked forward to seeing him do more with this, and I appreciated they got rid of the buffoonery aspect that we had with the R version and The World Is Not Enough. Of course, Cleese did appear in numerous James Bond video games and things, so he, like Judi Dench, did make more appearances outside their respective films. But again, I really wished we had gotten him in the role in one more film, at least. So this is the little transitional scene before we jump into Iceland, where, of course, it's revealed, shocker, that Miranda Frost is cold because she is a devoted MI6 agent. But, of course, since we know Bond was betrayed early on by, obviously, someone who had knowledge of MI6, let alone their records department, that probably it wasn't just someone who betrayed Bond, but someone who was a mole within MI6. So it becomes quickly obvious that perhaps Miranda is not what she seems, and the cold front is also for other reasons. It's not a very large mystery as to who perhaps betrayed Bond in North Korea. And again, they try to cover this by Miranda having a history of rejecting advances and how she has no interest in Bond whatsoever. And it's like it kind of overplays it a little bit. I also have to admit, I do feel M bringing up Miranda Frost's romantic history. It makes me think of Rosa Club and her questioning of Tanya in From Russia with Love. You know, the whole bit of, and you have had 3 lovers. What is the purpose of such an intimate a question? So now we're in the Iceland sequence. This is the point at which most people feel the film goes off the rails. They usually identify this moment here, which I can understand, but I think it starts to creep in the Cuba sequence with Jinx and the DNA beauty parlor. Now, of course, this is the other showstopper Piero Lamont's set of the film, The Ice Palace, which in the long shots there, you do see it is a digital composite on the long shots, and of course, Brosnan driving up again, all the backgrounds are digital replacements. Now, originally, this was supposed to be Graves like ice yachting or something, but Tamahori figured that wasn't propulsive enough, so they came up with this idea of the rocket ice vehicle and trying to set speed records and things, which again I actually like. I like the idea of Graves also being this ridiculous adventurer and always pushing the barriers and not caring if he lives or dies or achieves his goals, that it somehow gives him something that he needs. I like that idea. I don't mind it at all. And I like this little dialogue that he has with Bond about referencing Donald Campbell and Bond throwing it back at him. Campbell died on his return run. We get a little hint again about the Graves not needing sleep, and that, of course, is because the side effects of the DNA replacement therapy. Some of the dialogue is a little bit on the nose, you know, when Graves is continually saying things like, you know, it's how we know who we really are, under the skin. It's really highlighting how does Bond not pick up on some of this stuff earlier. But that stuff does stick in Bond's mind because once Jinx reveals she saw the light mask and Zhao in the Gustav's living quarters later on, that's how Bond is able to so quickly put 2 and 2 together to realize that Moon is still alive and Graves is Moon, and so on and so forth. Now, here's another moment that I really can't stand. Of course, Jinx is going to come back into the film, but we've literally stopped the film to cut away to not only show the product placement of the custom-designed Ford Thunderbird, but we get this slight slow-mo shot, and Jinx breath with a breathy line is like, "Thank you." It's like, why did we stop the movie? Benson's novelization has Bond see Jinx arrive, so he knows already that she's there, which I much prefer. I don't know why that moment has always irked me for some reason. But unfortunately, like a lot of the Jinx character, it just seems to stick out like a sore thumb. And again, it's not... another one, that joke there, Bond ordering a martini, plenty of ice if you can spare it. Yes, it's a nice joke, but of course Bond never gets ice in his drinks. I like that when Brosnan comes over to Jinx and they're using some of the old banter about bird watching and stuff. I like when he comes over, he almost puts on a slight accent. You know, it's like, right now I'm only interested in endangered species, which it makes me think of the George Baker dubbing of George Lazenby when he's undercover as Sir Hilary Bray in OHMSS. Again, that may be just me looking at a particular bit of line delivery, but that's always stuck out to me. It's rather weird that we cut from the dialogue there as we saw Miranda Frost approaching, and now we're cutting to the arrival of Zhao, and we see the dream mask and stuff. It's weird that we didn't have that we're intercutting, because now when we cut back to that scene, it's the same conversation, like no time has passed. Because this scene actually goes on for a little bit, and it is very important to the plot. Now we're going to immediately cut back to the discussion scene going on. I like the way that they play this at first. They have the silent taking in of each other and then immediately speak Korean. I like how each actor plays it. I like what Toby Stephens is doing with his facial reactions. He's playing the character differently here. He's dropped all the facade. So, again, I think he's doing interesting stuff with the role, but just, again, Rick Zhao, the same thing. Zhao has a physical impression he gives with every appearance, but here is one of his best moments in the film where he actually smiles a little bit and, shows that, he's obviously not just Moon's right-hand man, but probably his one and only friend in the world. And now, again, as I mentioned, now we're cutting back to Miranda approaching. So it's the same conversation we just left, but we just cut away to that really important stuff because we just got the full reveal that Graves is actually Moon. So it's kind of weird that we're cutting back and forth. Again, Graves now has the facade back on as he's doing the Icarus presentation. Something that's always made me curious, M says earlier in the film that they think that perhaps the Iceland demonstration is just another publicity stunt. Well, how in the world would no intelligence organization not be aware that Graves has not just instigated a space program, but built an entire satellite and done the whole Icarus project, and no one was apparently any the wiser that this thing was already sitting up in orbit, or had any notion he was working on anything in regards to space technology or anything. Makes you think almost of Drax in the film Moonraker, but at least there it's explained and believable how Drax would do this without anyone knowing. And of course, the space station has a radar jamming system, so it's not visible from Earth by radar. Again, when you start to look very closely and apply logic to the film's plot, you can find a lot of random plot holes or things that really make you question stuff. Here they do an interesting photographic effect. They sort of flare the image. I'm sure they probably did it with a combination of filters and then digital enhancement. And it's also interesting that, of course, the only people who don't don sunglasses are Graves, Bond, and Jinx. I like how Graves is almost staring directly at Bond, and again, they're the only ones without sunglasses. So there's a nice bit of Graves trying to give Bond some one-upmanship, and with the direct line, you have no idea how much Icarus is about to change your world. Then we see the cutaways to who will be revealed later as obvious North Korean backers. Bond is able to realize something's going on, but of course now we see Jinx has slipped away in the crowd, and so obviously she's up to no good yet again. There's a nice little David Arnold nod there. In this cue, you hear those little do-do-do nods. I've always felt that was him referencing John Barry's cue in Goldfinger when Bond is teasing the Korean as it's titled on the soundtrack, because Barry does a little motif there, and it's almost completely quoted by Arnold there. So now the much derided Aston Martin Vanish is going to be used in its invisible form for the first time. I guess I should go ahead and mention that here. I've never necessarily had a problem with the idea of the invisible Aston Martin. It just, when examined, yes, it seems stupid on the whole and pushing things way too far out of the bounds of reality. Bond is known to do that at times. Again, I don't really have a problem with it, but the more you think about it, the more offensive it becomes. Honestly, it's not used all that much, and it's kind of a non-entity in the overall film. Here you see Bond leave it, and ostensibly it's left sitting there in front of the side access door, and nobody bumps into it. And then later, when Bond needs the Vanquish again for the car chase, I guess he has to go get it out of there. We never see him pull it back into the parking lot, so I guess it's sitting there overnight. So here, the interesting but unfortunately kind of non-existent henchman of Vlad has improved the electroshock capability of the first gauntlet of what it will later become the full Icarus suit that some people have said makes Graves almost look like a cheap version of RoboCop. It appears Bond is perhaps a bit rusty in terms of infiltration because he seems to get spotted very quickly. But this is, of course, a setup to get him in the arms of Miranda Frost and have her reveal her true MI6 nature. Now, this is much more explicit in Benson's novelization, and apparently they did shoot it that way, where Miranda and Bond are actually naked in the hot tub we see later, the sort of geothermal pool thing. But they reshot it, and they made it much more compact. It probably works a little better this way, but I hate the little jump scare of her arm coming out. It's a little too much. But I like how Brosnan plays this, and I like the put your back into it line, trying to puncture her cold front and things, and she throws it right back at him. And of course, the death for breakfast part of the line is a direct Fleming pull because that is a actual chapter title. I believe it's from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And of course, they have to, as Bond says, I have to say it the way Brosnan does, keep up the charade of being lovers. So again, keeping to the idea of having an acceptable cover for spycraft. So while Bond is doing that with Miranda, Jinx has decided to infiltrate the dome and proves that this is not going to go very well for her. But of course, by doing this rather non-stealthy approach of going directly down the center of the dome on a wire, that being left there will allow Bond's easy escape later on, almost like a reference to For Your Eyes Only and Melina's air tank being left on the seafloor, saving both her and Bond's life after the end of the keel hauling sequence. Of course, when you closely examine Miranda's actions here, it does seem very obvious. It seems obvious on repeat viewings, but there is an off quality about her in this film, which of course suggests her turncoat status. Now, of course, Rosamund Pike was a very young actress at this point. This was pretty much her first film experience, and she does extremely well for it being, again, literally her first film. It's just unfortunate that the character is not written all that well or given a whole lot to do. One has to wonder what sort of a market there would be if they actually made the Dream Mask thing for real and sold it as a product. Of course, we had highlighted Bond's traditional hiding of the gun under the pillow, which he always sleeps with. That's a direct Fleming pull as well. But something that's always bugged me here, Miranda hands Bond his P99. Bond goes to check it at first and then puts it in his belt. And you see her with her hands here and this look on her face. So you know something's off, but what has always bugged me, and I am by no means a firearms expert, but you would have to think that Bond would recognize the difference between the weight of a loaded gun and an unloaded P99. Now here's one of the most egregious slow-mo moments where they do the speed ramp and we see Zhao's coat flip as he walks around Jinx. Again, those moments absolutely kill me. So here in the traditional interrogation sequence, it is not Bond, but Jinx who is being questioned. So again, this is another moment where Bond is essentially being replaced in his own film, and they went for the unfortunate choice of including a Your Mama joke in a James Bond film, which is just truly unfortunate and definitely does not help the audience like Jinx any more than they already perhaps did. Again, not a wise choice and tonally completely out of place for a James Bond film. And of course, the lasers in the room are going to come into play and be a extreme overcharged Goldfinger reference. The laser watch cutting through the ice is, of course, a reference to Bond first sporting the laser watch in GoldenEye in the official films, but of course he had a laser watch in Never Say Never Again, which was, of course, the unofficial 1983 film. And of course, Mr. Kill, as he's so goofily named, decides not to kill Jinx immediately, giving Bond enough time to come to her rescue. Bond will also pull out a rebreather here, very much styled after the iconic Thunderball rebreather. I do like this method of infiltration, though, because, of course, Bond, having done reconnoitering and spying around Gustav's living quarters the night before, he's able to piece together a potential means of entry. So, cutting through the ice. But, of course, had he been wrong, he would have had to get back to his ice hole very quickly and get out before risking death. But Bond's method is much stealthier and a much more approvable stealth entrance into this place than Jinx's method of just coming from the ceiling at night. But we do get the shot of the D-ring and the cable again. Bond sees it so again, but that's why he'll know it's there later on and use it to effect his escape. We have to wonder, Mr. Kill probably takes a long time to get his jollies because he's taking so long to slowly kill Jinx, but obviously was just somewhere else while waiting for Bond to come in and turn the laser off. Now, this is another great example of how amped up the film always feels it has to be. Again, something Tamahori was always pushing to do. So while the lasers are a reference to Goldfinger, one of the most iconic scenes in the entire series, that was simply one laser and threatening Bond, who was kept static and locked to the table, and the actual table made of gold. And the tension was ramped up beautifully in the performance, the editing, the scoring, and really gave a palpable sense of movement when there was none. Here, it's not one laser, it's a room full of lasers, and they're moving around, and there's a fight sequence, and there's a pulsing music cue with a lot of fast beats and a lot of techno flares and things. And there's also a damsel in distress and so many other things going on that it's honestly not really that effective because there's so many various elements going on. And again, it's taking the same scene in Goldfinger but amping it up into a overdriven action sequence that, has a slightly cheesy payoff, and there is a little humor in the way that the laser goes through the back of Kill's head and comes out of his mouth. The best part of the sequence is Bond takes a moment before freeing Jinx and is able to throw back some of her own dialogue at her. But the slight smile on Brosnan's face quickly drops as soon as Jinx says this certain thing about Zhao, and you see the coldness come across Bond. You see him processing this news and putting two and two together and realizing that not only has he solved the mystery, but he's had one pulled over on him. Moon is still alive. And he knows exactly now who has done all of these horrible things to him, and that he never achieved his original mission in the first place. Then comes the cute gag of the dismembered hand being used for the ID access point. course, it would have been much more helpful had Jinx gone on to get help anyway, or actually helped Bond. But we do get this nice confrontation scene between Bond and Graves, and actually a nice title drop. So like The World Is Not Enough, we get a title drop in the film that doesn't feel forced and has nice weight to it when Brosnan says the line. I like what each actor does with the performance here. I like that it's quiet. I like the harsh white light coming in through the big window behind Bond, and I like that there's no one else in the room, so it allows the moment to play out. And Graves has completely dropped the demeanor and actually is enjoying this, even though he's obviously staring down into what is possibly his own death. We're getting a little bit of exposition here. We're getting more of the exact in and outs of how Moon achieved all of this. And I like the notion that he created the character of Graves and modeled it after his impression of Bond. So once again, it's a classic Bond villain moment of having a certain reading of Bond and using that to insult Bond, and also causing the villain to have a certain disgust towards Bond. But here the villain has made it his own physical persona. So now he carries that with him in a number of ways. So he has made it a physical manifestation of that. I like the way that Tovey Stevens trails his voice off a little bit here when he is going to the reveal of Miranda's turncoat nature. Unfortunately, it does make Bond come across as looking very much the chump, especially when he goes to fire and, of course, the P99 is empty. Get the occupational hazard throwback. Again, Brosnan plays it perfectly, but it makes Bond look completely foolish. Which, of course, he would be in this scenario, but it feels a bit forced because Bond has to be caught at this point by his own mistakes, because that's what the script said. But you can see in Brosnan's eyes how he has Bond start to look around. He's already having to formulate a way out, and he can't come up with anything. Apparently, if you walk into Miranda's room and you say her name, the doors are going to lock. I've always felt that was an odd way to trap Jinx. She walks in and says Miranda's name. Here, Bond has come up with his way of escaping. He purposely insults Zhao, gets Zhao to punch him, and then uses that to overplay his reaction. He's given over every gadget except for the ring. He's kept the ring for last, and by overplaying his reaction, is able to bring the sonic agitator ring and break the glass floor. And that's a wonderful shot when he and Miranda both crash through the glass floor. I don't know if they applied any slow motion effects to it. I don't even think they did, but it's a really nice effect to it. Again, with Brosnan running around, you have to keep in mind every time he's doing the action sequences, he was still working on that injured knee from the pre-title sequence. So again, I just always come away with more appreciation even for the small moments like that. And I like Bond's ingenuity in using what's available. So he sees Jinx repelling cord earlier, uses that to get out, and then spots Graves, I don't know exactly what you call it, but his ice speed machine rocket car. Unfortunately, there's another one of those speed ramp effect edits. And of course, the villain enjoying as Graves says, the thrill is in the chase. It's a nice moment, as is the added beat where Vlad identifies that Bond has actually broken Graves' own speed record without even trying, and the look that Graves gets. So it's a little bit of accidental one-upmanship. But unfortunately, this is the start of the most notable awful CG in the film. The actual Icarus beam is not bad. Of course, the idea of having a satellite weapon in orbit makes you think of GoldenEye, but really, it's much more of a very grandiose version of the laser satellite Blofeld has in Diamonds Are Forever. So it's really a nod to Diamonds Are Forever. And then Bond breaking off the sides, the side support struts of the ice car in the trees makes you think of the Living Daylights when the V8 Vantage loses its outriggers in the trees. And again, there is some model work there. Everything you see with the trees is model shots. So even in the CG stuff, you do have actually really great model work that is unfortunately overshadowed. One of the worst shots is coming up here when the actual ice car goes over and the hook stops it and you see it flop downward. For me, it's perhaps the worst effect shot in the film. Coming up right here, it's this awful, it looks like a tiny toy car, and they put this awful slow-mo on it that makes it look even more unreal. It looked terrible even when I saw the film for the first time, especially on a big screen. For me, that's actually the worst effects shot in the film, even worse than the infamous kite parachute surfing sequence that's coming up here. I like Bond having to use his ingenuity again. I always come back to that. And, managing to pull off and make an improvised sled, which makes you think of using the improvised part of the snowmobile to snowboard in the pre-title sequence of A View to a Kill. Again, you can make nods to the past films everywhere because the film does it. So while it's a nice way for Bond to use his wits to escape at the last moment, it is, of course, ruined by this, again, infamous moment where the giant part of the ice floe creates this huge wave, completed entirely in CG. We cut away, which builds some nice tension, and then we are going to cut back to what we know is coming, this moment here. And again, you have to hand it to Brosnan, who is in front of a green screen, obviously, and he's having to try and sell this as a sequence, which is something no actor can do with ease. And to give him great credit, he is trying his best, and the performance is fine. It's doing what it's supposed to do, but it is not supported at all by the ridiculous surroundings he finds himself in. And then immediately you cut here to Brosnan actually coming down off of a real parachute in front of real ice, and it's the difference is so immediately dramatic that it is so much more exciting to watch Pierce Brosnan 2 feet off the ground hanging off a parachute than it is in that god-awful windsurfing CG sequence. That, of course, is the first major time a Bond film had an entirely CGI action sequence in any way, shape, or form, where it was literally the entire sequence replacing the traditional practical effects work. And thankfully, it is decried as it should be. But if you look at reports at the time, everybody was seemingly pretty proud of that. And while CG was, much more of a newer technology, it had been around for a good number of years at this point. It still didn't look very good in 2002, and definitely does not look like anything near acceptable, especially not today. But that is the primary thing, along with the invisible Aston Martin, that everyone will highlight and cite in Die Another Day. Even if they haven't seen the film, they know that. I also think the shots of the Antonov plane there look ropey. Again, the CG badness, the bad CG shots are all over the place. It's not just the kite surfing sequence. It's all the digital background replacements. It's a lot of stuff. Because Tamahori did insist on pushing the CG envelope. And it is nice to think that he was always trying to push things to be a bit different and to be a bit edgier, and you have to have some degree of that, but you can't go too far, and you can't completely embrace that while losing part of your core identity. And that's unfortunately what happens throughout Die Another Day. And it gets exacerbated by the continual, almost frantic energy that he's just pumping into every character and every scene, and unfortunately dumbs down the film. Here's another moment. While Bond is searching for Jinx, he takes a minute to take off his, I guess, slightly wet. He should be soaked from the surfing sequence earlier. But he takes off the outer sweater, and then the snowmobile crashes over the invisible Aston Martin, which alerts Zhao to Bond's presence. And in a completely ridiculous moment, Zhao runs to a Jaguar XKR, of course, more product placement, but it looks great, that of course has not only a thermal imager, but is completely loaded with gadgets as if it was a Bond car in and of itself. And this becomes the Battle of the Cars sequence. So it's a ridiculous idea that the villain's car would be completely decked out with missiles and gadgets as if it were Bond's car. Now there's a gigantic speed ramp there to lead us into the ice chase part. There is beautiful photography of these cars going around, particularly the Aston Martin going slightly sideways and kicking up ice spray. And of course, this was all done for real on extremely treacherous ice floes that were, had to be checked every day for melting. Vic Armstrong spent, days out here doing this sequence, and it should be riveting. It looks fantastic, but it is completely undone by this whole cheeky battle of missiles and gadgets. It should be about the terror of driving on ice and having to deal with a villain who is a good driver. It should have the tenacity of the ice driving sequences of, say, for example, John Gardner's Icebreaker novel, his third James Bond novel, where Bond finds himself in the Arctic Circle, and there's actually a pretty nice little sequence where Bond is in his Saab 900 Turbo and he's confronted by cars and snowplows, and he's having to use ice rally techniques. Again, the images are nice, and the image of the Aston Martin upside down sliding at speed and then using the ejector seat to launch it back right side up as the missile comes through it. I mean, it's a nice moment, but it's a moment out of a fantasy film, and you're losing the impact of the fact these cars are really driving on ice. Instead, you're getting these cute gags of each weapon taking out the other weapon, when it should be again about Bond's superior driving skill and his ability to stay alive. I know I'm nitpicking this, but I do really feel it's important, and it's another sign about how the film is becoming more and more about grand, show-stopping, flashy, hey, wouldn't it be cool if moments, which you need, again, some degree of that, but you can't let that take over everything, and that's what's happening here. So as amazing as this is, the end of this sequence is more impactful. I like the shot of the two cars going towards the ice palace. David Arnold swells up with an ice cube, and then we smash into Peter Lamont's ice palace set that had to be specially reinforced to accommodate the cars inside. So for me, the battle of the cars inside the ice palace actually becomes more impactful than them tearing away outside on the real ice, which is really unfortunate because the whole sequence should be that fantastic. But here we actually get more drama, even though they have less room to maneuver in. And of course, the idea is that Bond is also running against a ticking clock because Jinx is obviously drowning inside of Miranda's room, melting. Another aspect of the sound mix I like in this sequence is how they Foley up the effect of the Aston Martin's engine. So the roar of the engine takes the place of Bond's emotions. What makes this scene good for me, though, is I like that, again, Bond uses the gadgets to fulfill his own wit. So, of course, I don't know why Zhao would have this sort of death spike on the front of his car. Of course, the tire spikes are a nod to the Living Daylights with the ice spikes and the Vantage. This is the moment why I'm fine with the invisible car. Bond using it to his advantage and using it to give the slip on Zhao and make him crash down and crash the XKR. Get a nice bloody effect as Zhao is crushed and destroyed. Maybe a little reminiscent of Trevelyan's death in GoldenEye. But giving Bond a nice moment of personal revenge against Zhao, at least. So the mention about the suitcase, foreshadowing the eventual suit version of the Icarus control mechanism. So again, Bond having some desperation here, and then I like the fact that he just drives smack into the ice wall to break Jinx out. Unfortunately, he wrecks the Aston Martin by then breaking the windshield with the ring. But again, it is showing the intensity of Bond's emotions here, which is something that Brosnan was always fighting to get in the films. But his whole desperation to save Jinx is, again, going to the idea of how they're trying to sell her as, like, an ultimate Bond woman and that she's so special. And it's like, well, we haven't really seen anything in the film to earn that. So, again, that whole forcing the notion of Jinx is special and Jinx is great, it also heightens my extreme dislike of the character. Now, this is the sort of geothermal pool hot tub I alluded to earlier, where it would have been Bond and Miranda having their false encounter. I have to admit, the line, "the cold kept you alive," always kind of cracks me up a little bit just because it seems so unlogical. It is a nice moment, though, I must admit, where Bond is barely able to save the love interest of the film, and so we don't have the traditional sacrificial lamb, although that is a traditional part of a Bond film, that is a necessary quotient. This transitional sequence in the military zone is sort of reminiscent of the moment in Tomorrow Never Dies, where Bond arrives and they go over the GPS encoder before they go off on the Halo jump sequence. It's a little bit of a breather, but it is a little bit generic, too. Another nice, tiny moment for Colin Selman's Robinson, again, returning after the previous two films. Another great character from the Brosnan era who unfortunately is so underused but has become a real fan favorite. This is actually very important for the exposition, the whole bit about there being a coup in the North Korean military command, and now everyone is aligned under Moon, and his father's been taken out and placed in prison and things, is of course establishing how Moon has been able to do all of this, and that's why he had the North Koreans in Iceland earlier. Now all this is coming into play. Now Falco is hoisted on his petard a little bit, having to admit he was wrong about Bond while not admitting anything. Again, Madsen has a nice presence, but it just kind of feels a little off for being essentially the American equivalent of M in this scenario. Again, I think it would have been much more fitting had he actually been a version of Felix Leiter. And of course, Bond comes into the control room and immediately is able to put two and two together and realize that he will have to go in and infiltrate the area. I do like the gag they have in here about how there's supposed to be no direct American involvement, but then they decide to send Jinx in anyway. And this here with the switchblades, again, makes you think of the Halo jump in Tomorrow Never Dies. But again, while that had real free fall elements, this unfortunately becomes a CG sequence that looks like it's from a video game cutscene. Of course, the actual switchblade technology is based on, real life elements, and it does make sense that there would be a stealth insertion type vehicle that the U.S. Army would have developed in some way, shape, or fashion. But its handling here does make it feel very video gamey. And this shot of the missile here is a direct steal because that is the same missile shot from the pre-title sequence of Tomorrow Never Dies. It is literally reused. I like the visual, though, of Graves being in the North Korean bunker, but he has the military uniform and the leather jacket on. So it's like he's taken on the accoutrements of his purported position already, but of course he's not his original visage. He's in the form of Graves. Again, a bit of Diamonds Are Forever there, with the satellite being uncontrollable and then taking out means to disable it. Now, if you look closely here, the major Michael G. Wilson cameo, he plays one of the American generals inside the control bunker. I find it interesting that Bond has been sent in and he and Jinx are there with a sniper rifle, and the idea is they're just there to literally assassinate Graves. And they have this one brief opening and then hesitate just long enough to where if they can't take him out. But the idea is originally just to simply do an assassination, and I guess then they think that will end matters. And of course, the entire climax taking place on a cargo plane like this is a definite nod to The Living Daylights. But originally, the ending was in a different locale, and Tamahori felt they should change it, and they actually came up with the whole plane ending while shooting. Now, this scene here of actually getting on the plane via the landing gear should be a direct tie-in to Bond using the landing gear to get off the plane in London, but of course, we didn't get that scene, so this was, I guess, supposed to be a bit of a full circle moment by showing Bond infiltrate a plane via landing gear, which may be the reason why they cut that earlier scene out in the first place, that they didn't want to repeat the same thing twice. Another nice touch is we actually see the bust we saw in Moon's quarters in the pre-title sequence. It's there on the plane. Now we can see the entire cargo bay complete with a winch door in the background and everything. Again, seems completely modeled after the Hercules in The Living Daylights. Now, this is a nice scene where we're resolving the father-son dynamic, and there has been a tinge set up of the sort of son who feels that he was never wanted or appreciated and always felt the outsider. But it's not really developed enough, so it comes up here and is just sort of explained away. Although both actors do play the scene very well, it gives a nice insight into the potential villain motivations and how he was able to so easily say goodbye to not just his old life, but his actual physical appearance. And I like the reference to a self art of war and the little quote he has, but it's undone by the silliness of the robotic suit that he's stuck wearing. It also looks weird to have Bond in just like generic army combat fatigues and with a camo jacket on. The best part of the scene here is getting the emotional connection between the two characters, and we have the father run his hand over the bust of his seemingly dead son, and then touch Graves' face, and we can see the sort of recognition, as I guess apparently the cheekbone structure is supposedly the same. And I like that sort of sick smile that comes across Graves' face, and then it fades away as he realizes that his father still is probably not going to grasp the genius of his plan. And again, it's kind of undone by the very silly-looking headgear that he puts on. Now, this is really nice effects work. I love all the shots of the exploding landmines, which I'm pretty sure were done practically. It's really nicely done. My particular favorite we'll come to in a little bit, but when all the mines start going off in the rows, that's I think one of the most effective shots in the film. This is another moment where Arnold's music cue has a little bit of feel of the previous film. So the music here almost has a tinge of his pipeline cue from The World's Not Enough. What makes this scene effective is Graves' complete belief in his plan, and of course his father not accepting any of this, which means it's quite obvious that from the moment the sequence starts, that Graves is going to do away with his father and wanted to apparently probably do that for a long time. But it is played well. It's a nice dynamic, but unfortunately, since the elder moon is only in the beginning and ending of the film, it doesn't have a whole lot of dramatic weight to it. Once that scene's over, you pretty much forget about it. Another slight tinge of The Living Daylights, where Bond's companion winds up having to pilot the plane herself. Now, that shot of Vlad there reacting, it comes into play just shortly thereafter because they reuse that once Graves kills his father. They literally reuse that same shot. It's also interesting to note that the actual electrocution effects haven't seemed to have improved much after the same effects in Return of the Jedi. I do like the staging here, where Graves turns off the electrocution, uses it to pull his father close, says the line in Korean, then shoots him. But unfortunately, it's undone by more forced slow-mo, and again, reusing that same reaction shot of Vlad there. And we get more slow-mo here as he falls. I like that his hat comes off his head. Then more forced slow-mo. We see Graves turn around with that sneering grin, and then just happen to spot Bond, whose bullet gets knocked astray. And now this becomes a recreation of the iconic ending of Goldfinger, where the bullet literally breaks the window, and we literally see, once again, everything and everyone gets sucked out into space until the cabin depressurizes, and it becomes a one-on-one Bond and villain fight. Again, it must be said that apparently this entire ending was reworked or moved to this plane sequence. It's alluded to it being Tamahori's idea. I don't know exactly what the original ending would have been entirely, because again, there are no available script drafts. But I've always felt this ending was underwhelming. But when I found out that literally happened and they rewrote this during production, it made a lot of sense. They do amp things up by Jinx turning the plane to actually go through the path of the Icarus beam itself. So then the plane is not only on autopilot, but it's actually falling apart. That amps up things more, but you really don't feel it all that much. So it doesn't have the same resonance of the submarine climax of The World Is Not Enough, which itself was underwhelming in terms of the scale of the action, but was satisfying enough emotionally because it closed off the characters of Electra and Renard and Bond's relationship and that sort of love triangle of sorts, the triangle between the three characters. So I feel The World's Not Enough had a satisfying climax for its characters and emotionally, if not as the climax action-wise for the film. But here, I don't even think you get that sense of fulfillment. So it feels completely underwhelming, whereas I think The World's Not Enough at least has that internal satisfaction. And that shot's coming up here. There's the Michael G. Wilson cameo as the panicked American general. And coming up here is the shot of the mines right there as they all go off. That for me timed to all the monitors blowing up at the same time inside the control room. It's well done, and I think you feel the drama and stakes of that far more than you do anything here with the plane. Although it is a nice idea for Jinx having steered it into the beam to at least have some sort of way to overcome being held at sword point, even though it probably meant certain doom. But again, you can get that sense I've talked about many times so far about having to amp everything up to 11 and elevate everything and make everything bombastic on top of already being a bit bombastic. It's always having to overcome itself and go bigger, and you really don't need to do that all the time. So, of course, it's not just a plane going down. Now it's a sword fight, and Jinx has to have two swords. And we have to cut away from the main Bond villain fight to go to the secondary Bond villain fight, which detracts from the importance in the screen time of the primary fight and dilutes both fights ultimately. Again, more forced slow-mo. And then this cutting back and forth to show when Bond and Jinx get a sort of second wind, again links them and suggests again that Jinx is perhaps the ultimate Bond woman and is again special and a super agent of sorts, which not only downplays Bond in his own movie, but suggests Jinx is special for reasons that we have never been shown in the film. Although I must admit it is ultimately a bit satisfying seeing Miranda get her just desserts because she's been so completely one note and distant and cold and throughout the entire film. And of course, you do have to get little traditional flashes of the classic, what we all like to refer to as Pierce Brosnan's pain face in this climax, where he always has the intensive face acting and grimacing. But of course, it wouldn't really be a Brosnan era Bond film without at least some of the beautiful pain face moments. It's rather interesting that they have Graves here go into his sort of PR television interview style dialogue, particularly here with the time to face destiny. It's just kind of bizarre. And of course, it is nice that Bond uses the villain's own ego, and the villain is undone by his own particular devices, which we get played into here by Bond activating the electricity on the suit, although why it would be designed to be able to injure or electrocute the wearer doesn't make any sense. You have to think that perhaps maybe the Graves getting killed in the plane propeller is a nod to Carver getting killed by the CVAC and Tomorrow Never Dies. You get a nice little bit of Falco looking ruffled and then deciding to light a cigarette anyway. But of course, all is not over. Bond and Jinx must escape the crashing plane. We get a nice little moment where Bond sees Miranda's corpse, and it's almost a tradition of sorts where Brosnan's Bond pauses over the dead body of, we had Paris and Tomorrow Never Dies, then Electric King and The World's Not Enough, and now a moment with Miranda and Die Another Day. Again, back to the Living Daylights nods here. So instead of a Jeep coming out of the back of a Hercules, now it's a helicopter. And apparently the helicopter or the Bond and Jinx inside an air vehicle plummeting to Earth, having to get it started, was apparently in an earlier place in the film, in earlier drafts. But Tamahori liked the idea so much that he moved it to the climax and made it this helicopter. I like the idea. It's a great action climax idea, but unfortunately, it's got a lot of CGI work, which kind of undoes the whole idea and the impact of it. And we see the cars going off. Of course, that's nodding to apparently Moon's penchant for exotic sports cars that we saw in the pre-title sequence, and we'll get the fun gag paying that off when we see them stuck in apparently what looks like a farmer's field or something like that. Again, more iffy backgrounds behind the actors. And then especially when you see the big reflections of all the giant pieces of plane that go by, and then we see all the little tiny bits and bobs that go past. But of course, all of it is completely in CGI land, so none of this really has much of an impact. And we're already overwhelmed by everything that's come up to this point, so we're just kind of in this moment of stasis where we know this is dangerous and there's high stakes and they're plummeting to Earth, but we can't really feel or process any of it. And then the diamonds in the back is obviously a nod to License to Kill and Bond managing to take the seaplane, and of course it's filled with all the drug money in the back. And so the helicopter plummeting and managing to just overcome the danger takes the place of the traditional final danger tag. Instead of having Bond fight the henchman of the villain at the very end of the film, here we had the final action beat. And once again, tying it back into a line that Jinx had previously said. So once again, having a bit more of directorial misdirection. So we're made to think we're just going to have a final coda at MI6, a little bit of viewing of actual MI6 materials, obviously closing the file on Miranda Frost, and the story as we have seen, and coming up with the cover story, Moneypenny having to work late in the office. Now, this scene is obviously total fan service, and you can see in Brosnan's performance, he's playing it very straight, which is suggesting already that this is not real. And once again, we are in the VR machine, as we saw earlier. And this is obviously something Moneypenny has cooked up. While the actors play this well, and while this is, sort of fulfilling decades of what-if questions by the audience, it feels so wrong. This is the type of scene that never needs to happen, even though it's fantasy. Obviously, it really even undercuts Moneypenny's character, and really is breaking a taboo of sorts. I'm sure this was something Tamahori thought was a good idea, but again, it's fine, and yeah, it's a cute gag when Q walks in and suddenly the audience realizes for sure, and Moneypenny has to button up her shirt, and she has to catch her breath, and we see Q kind of cue in on the fact that, oh, wait, was she doing what I think she was doing? Which is the best part of the scene, when you see Q's reaction shot, once the little thing he's working on breaks, and you see him look back over, do a double take. but it's just a moment that feels so wrong, even though it is apparently Moneypenny's fantasy. It really cheapens the character, I think. And then for the final fade out, we have this sunlit visage, and David Arnold goes for a cue that harkens back to John Barry's You Only Live Twice, and again has some of the themes he created for The World Is Not Enough. So it feels very similar to his ending music for that film. And the setting does almost feel You Only Live Twice, particularly once we cut inside here and you see the actual design. And while it's a cute idea to have the diamonds here, it just something about this being the actual ending of the Bond film, it just feels a bit too simple, and it's sort of the same problem I have with the final fade out of The World Is Not Enough, where it's Bond and Christmas. We have the very, very terrible pun. What's also annoying here is they actually give Jinx the last line of the film, even though it's, well, I should say the last sound, because the last thing we hear and see in Die Another Day is Jinx laughing, which, again, it just feels a little weird. And it's a very subdued ending for the film, and became a very subdued ending for what ultimately was the end of Pierce Brosnan's tenure in the role. And that closes out Die Another Day, which, again, as a film, it is, at best a very mixed bag. It's not a bad film, but it becomes infuriating in many ways, particularly when you study what the approach was and, how it could, essentially how it could have been handled better. And again, not to harp on about Lee Tamahori as the director of the film, but really he pushed it to a place where it really didn't need to go. While I think the story idea was fine, I think it needed more finessing and perhaps more writers like the previous film had. And unfortunately, what could have been a solid film, and even starts out that way, it not only goes off the rails, it really has a tonality and a feel that feels very un-Bond. And I think that's also heightened by the editing style that's trying to insert different stylistics that were more of the time. And also, David Tattersall's photography is very vivid and very lush in a lot of places, but it's also... it feels very unworldly. It doesn't have a lot of grounded reality once we get to Iceland, and I think that just heightens the sort of science fiction fantasy aspects that we cross over into by that point. So while I think the actual photography is quite good, I think it doesn't always have that requisite Bondian feel. People like to complain about Moonraker, but it being too much of a fantasy science fiction film, but the photography there is very subtle in places, very beautifully handled. Everything is very lovingly lit, and it does feel very grounded overall, even the space sequences, whereas this film really does not have that same grounding in terms of the visuals. And then on top of that, we have the overusage of very unconvincing CGI throughout, which does not help in selling any of the sequences and becomes a detriment when it becomes far too obvious. And for me, it's always been there ever since my first viewing of this film on its opening day in 2002. There are moments throughout. It's not just the surfing sequence. It's from that first moment we have Bond coming on the beach in North Korea in the pre-title sequence. It's the backgrounds, it's a lot of the small things, and that's something that we had never had in a Bond film to this point. And again, there had been CGI usage since GoldenEye, but it was very tastefully done and blended in where it needed to be. And if you have to use CGI in a James Bond film, that's what you have to do. And I think the producers had learned that from this experience. So it was perhaps helpful that, it happened this time and they went way too far, and then were at least able to realize that was a mistake. So here in the credits, we close with a dance mix edit of Madonna's title theme, the Dirty Vegas mix, and the credits for the DTS ES and Dolby Digital EX mixes of the film. again, the soundtrack design of this film is really what makes it fun to rewatch in a home theater environment, at least. So with that, we close out the end credits of the film, and this was essentially the end of Pierce Brosnan's tenure in the role. James Bond would return indeed, but after a significant period of readjustment and reworking, and honestly, they did indeed hit the reboot button, and this really remains the last true Bond film of the original run. After this point, things become different and they go on a different path. So Die Another Day is not just the final film of the Brosnan era, but really the final film of the original 20 films. I think it's very important to make that distinction because they really did hit the reset button, and there was a significant gap after this point. There has been talk that Brosnan would have done a fifth film, that perhaps negotiations broke down. Some people say that Pierce Brosnan was fired from the role or let go from the role. It's still unclear, really, how it went down, and you have to really just make up your own idea as to how it happened. Some say it was a salary dispute, but ultimately Die Another Day was extraordinarily successful. It did break box office records for Bond films, and it was by no means a failure or a reason to stop the Brosnan tenure or to completely decide this was the point at which to change lead actors and go in a different direction. And it's really unfortunate that this was Brosnan's final outing because it really doesn't give him the polished exit. He doesn't get to, I think, really finalize everything he tried to do in the role. And so I think it's important for every lead Bond actor to have that ability. Everybody likes to talk about the third film being where they really get into the role and become comfortable in the role. And I think there is a degree of that, but also the final film has to have something to it. With both Sean Connery and Roger Moore, their final films of the official series are not always viewed with glowing eyes by most fans and most audience members. I happen to think they're both masterpieces, but both of them do, in a way, in both Diamonds Are Forever and A View to a Kill, allow a sort of goodbye. It allows, over the course of the film, to enjoy a final adventure with that particular Bond and that particular vision of James Bond, but it allows that goodbye to take place over the course of the entire film's running time. So it's not just a one and done and a final fade out and James Bond will return and with a different face in 3 years. And this is the same thing that happened to Timothy Dalton, who was really cheated out of a third film when, in the post-aftermath of License to Kill in 1989, we had the legal hurdles and the MGM craziness and their various buyouts and things that caused the 6-year gap between License to Kill and GoldenEye and almost ended the series prematurely. So for me, Brosnan's performance is really the saving grace of the film and the best thing to come away with. But unfortunately, it is undermined by the incessant dialing up of everything in the film and the sort of left turns that it takes and the fact that Bond has to frequently take a back seat to the Jinx character. And they did toy with and actually prepare a Jinx spin-off film. It was announced. They developed a screenplay with Purvis and Wade, and Halle Berry was going to star in it. It was going to be a big thing. But apparently it was MGM who nixed the whole project and kind of made everybody at Eon a bit mad because they had put all this effort into making a Jinx spinoff. And I, for one, have always been beyond glad that this never came to light because I have never liked the Jinx character, and the thought of her having an entire spin-off film as a generic action film, much in the vein of what we saw in Die Another Day, just sounded like a terrible experience to me. I would have much rather had the proposed Wei Lin spinoff film. That was an idea they had before and almost went with. So apparently they dusted that idea off and thought, oh, maybe we'll do a Jinx spinoff film. And not much information has been known about that until recently, where apparently some of the original prepared script has leaked online, so some people have actually seen pieces of it. And from reports, it just not sound very good. And I'm so beyond glad we never had that see the light of day. And again, this is not to demean Halle Berry as an actress at all. It's just I've never liked the character in this film, particularly because we are repeatedly told and shown that Jinx is supposed to be some super agent and is extraordinarily great, and it's sort of shoved down our throats, which is, again, the antithesis of what we had with Wei Lin in Tomorrow Never Dies, who is a far superior character and is never once annoying to an audience. So Dino of the Day really is almost a failed experiment of sorts, because it's interesting, truly fascinating to see how Purvis and Wade are taking unused Fleming elements and blending them into a new narrative, just as Michael G. Wilson and Richard Maybaum did with all the films of the 1980s. But what Purvis and Wade are not able to recapture is that particular talent for blending those elements into a coherent and fully cohesive film narrative, which all 5 films of the 1980s do. Even though License to Kill did have to eventually be written by Michael J. Wilson solo due to the 1988 Writers Guild strike, and I think suffers a bit from that. But particularly those 4 co-written by Maybaum and Wilson did an impeccable job of making fully cohesive new film narratives that were peppered and built with Fleming material that had not yet been used. And so it was fully inherent, but not simply replaying those events out, and also making sure that every element didn't stick out, that everything was, again, fully cohesive. For me, that's the biggest problem with Die Another Day in terms of its story and construction. But you can't really pay attention to that because you're so taken and having to deal with the over-the-top factor, and again, this sort of feeling like the film has a case of attention deficit disorder and that everything is dialed up to 11. And again, I have to go back to Lee Tamahori being allowed to just put the cart before the horse and drive this overbearing, over-the-top intensity, and also trying to hit and attract a youth market that was used to films of that nature, which were becoming more and more popular at this time. So you lose a lot of the Bond identity, or maybe not lose, but it gets subdued. And that's a big problem with a James Bond film. If you're subduing the identity of not just Bond's character, but the actual identity of the film series itself, then there's no point for you to make a James Bond film. You should go make something else. And Tamahori did do that before and afterwards. And again, I think he did have some good ideas, and he does do some good work. It's not to say that he's a bad director. I just think in this case, he was not the correct choice to direct a James Bond film. Or at least he shouldn't have been allowed this level of carte blanche to, again, put the cart before the horse. And for me, that is the primary problem with the film overall. And that's what gives it the incredible cringe factor to it. So when I rewatch Die Another Day every year, I want to like it so badly, and I like things in it. And I particularly like the opening 35 minutes where we have Bond using his wits, and we're able to see Brosnan in character having to muse and figure out his place in the world and follow the breadcrumb trail of the mystery going on and actually be in the moment, which is great and is riveting, and it is the best material in the entire film. But then we completely go away with that, and again, Bond continually gets subdued and put in the backseat of a James Bond film, which you should never do. And everything else continually gets dialed up further and further and further, and just overwhelms not just the narrative and the story and Bond himself, but it overwhelms the audience as if it's trying to overwhelm you into submission and to just go with it and to turn your brain off and chuck everything at the door as you go in and just go for the ride, which is how you make some films. But that's not how you make a James Bond film, because without a story and without the identity of a James Bond film, then again, why are you doing this in the first place? You should go make something else. So again, the more you study this and the development process, I think you can see how things started to sort of go off the rails in the pre-production stage, and it sort of snowballed from there, and it became bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually just got messier and messier. And again, it's interesting to note how at the time everybody talked highly of this and they thought they'd done a great job, and a lot of the critical reception was actually very positive. But I think the grumblings and the rumblings started to gain more in terms of voice over time, because I did notice the general perception of the film really took a nosedive in the immediate aftermath, particularly after the first year or two that the film was available on DVD and home video, and people started watching it repeatedly. Because again, at first, I know there was some backlash, particularly in the fan community, but if you weren't talking to Bond fans and you were just talking to general audiences, most people generally enjoyed it. And it was interesting to physically see for myself the actual complete sea change in opinion on the film, with most people, again, mostly average people who are not James Bond fans. Because, again, most people, if you go up to them and ask them their feelings on Die Another Day, and you have to, explain which one it is, and they go, the one with the invisible car, and they face palm and they say, oh no, that one was just silly, and so on and so forth. And so I think now it leaves a bad taste in most people's mouth. And that I think is a good way to describe it, because overall the film does sort of leave a bad taste in the mouth. And I think it's these un-Bondian elements and these deliberate attempts to push a Bond film into completely different areas that are not breaking new ground, but it's pushing Bond into elements that it should not have, and making some things more generic, and again, giving a Bond audience a bad taste. It leaves you feeling a bit icky and like something's not right. And again, this is that cringe factor I continually come back to, because that's what you're left feeling, and it just intensifies over time with repeat viewings and things. So it's a hard film to defend, and it's taken me an extremely long time to piece this material together and try to come up with my own feelings on the film, because I even find it hard to describe. I do think it's overall, it's not a bad film, but it has many elements in it that are questionable, and not just from a Bond standpoint, from just a general filmmaking standpoint. So, again, it is a very hard film to defend, and I find it is most rewarding to really try and dig into it as much as I possibly can, and try and get my hands on stuff and try and see things from a different perspective. But again, I think the key factor is you have Purvis and Wade trying something new and different with their screenplay, and just it not really being finessed and developed to the point that it really needed to be. And again, I don't know if maybe it would have been necessary again to have more writers come in, and have other credited writers come in and do more drafts and develop it further, like we had seen on The World Is Not Enough. But again, I keep coming back to it, but Tamahori coming in and really pushing the film in these directions I've highlighted, I think that's what really makes it unsettling when you see it. It's what really makes it stick out, and he really did push for the ramping up of the CGI usage, which is, again, what most people are going to immediately focus in on. So again, it's not to try and place the blame all entirely on one person, but in this case, I think Tamahori was really the central figure and the figurehead, and the reason why a lot of the Die Another Day isms are what they are. And I do think he put his stamp on the film in that sense, and it does serve as a good warning of sorts of, you can push certain things to a certain point, but particularly with James Bond, where everything is so vividly identified, and you do have a formula that you do have to adhere to a narrative progression sense. It's a spine of the film. You can experiment with it, you can push it in some different directions, but it's still the spine of a James Bond film. And when you mess with the actual flavor of a James Bond film, and you introduce different tonalities, and you make things a bit more generic, and you're trying to appeal to a different market, you're diluting the identity of the Bond film experience. And unfortunately, I think that's what happens in Die Another Day. And for me, that's why it comes up short. Although I do praise it for different things, and I do still think there are good things in it, ultimately, it is the one film of the original 20-film series that, for me, comes up short and is the most really, it's the only one that I feel is truly disappointing in terms of, I don't think it hit the proper level that it even could have. I do think it comes up short, and it does expand upon a number of the problems I think exist in The World Is Not Enough. So unfortunately, I don't think they learned from that experience, and all those problems got magnified on Die Another Day, but with a completely different tonality. Instead of being about character and being very dark and about human drama, it's now become big and bombastic, and you have a laser from space, and there is character stuff, but it almost feels cartoonish in comparison. So that is my general feeling on Die Another Day, Bond 20 from 2002. It's a film I've lived with for a very long time. Again, I saw it on its opening release day in a brand new, extremely top-end theater, and then I saw it 2 more times on its original run, and I've seen it, an untold number of times on video and DVD and Blu-ray in the years since. But it remains a very elusive film, and it's a very hard film to defend. And by no means am I trying to attack it or tear it apart, because it is a film that I feel most people never look at seriously, and everyone is so quick to attack it or make fun of it or talk about the terrible CGI usage, but they're not really getting into the real dramatic meat of what's going on. And I think to understand any film, you really have to do that and get into the actual bone and sinew of the narrative and what the character arcs are doing. So I do think there is good stuff there. So it is like all of the original films. I will always defend it to the death, although it is the hardest film to defend because there are so many obvious problems going on, and I would be the first to admit those. So I hope this has been informative. If you've stuck through me babbling about Die Another Day, I truly appreciate it. I knew this was going to be the hardest commentary to do in terms of the original films, because it is the one film that is unquestionably problematic, and unfortunately was the note at which Pierce Brosnan's Bond went out on, accepting his appearance in the Everything or Nothing game in 2004. So it's a bit bittersweet because it is the last film of the Brosnan tenure. He didn't get the great send-off that he really deserved, and also, again, it is the last film of the original series, truly. In a lot of ways, you could almost look at the whole Brosnan era as a sort of transitional point to where we find ourselves now, where the official Eon series has sort of gone off on a completely different path once they hit the reset button. So you really have to look at the core as you have the first 16 films, and then you have the 4 films of the Brosnan era. So collectively, the first 20 films are the original series, if we can make that a label for Bond. So there is that sort of bittersweet quality that I feel every time I rewatch the film. Again, I rewatch the whole series in order, usually once a year. So I rewatch all the films, and then I get to Die Another Day and get to the end, and there's that sort of bittersweet feeling because you wish there had been something more for Brosnan's Bond. You wish he'd had a better send-off, and you always wish the film had turned out better than it did. But again, there are some riches there. There are some great things in there that I tried to highlight, and I do particularly appreciate now, especially how Purvis and Wade did try to use those Fleming elements from The Man with the Golden Gun, and particularly Moonraker, which had never been used before, and tried their best to make it a new cinematic experience. So that is, I think, also rewarding. So with that, thank you so very much for listening, and I truly appreciate you sticking with me for my babbles on Die Another Day. I will return soon with my next Bond commentary, and as always, I'm very humbly yours, the Motion Picture Analyst.